the quiet panic nobody talks about, is not loud. It doesn't scream. It doesn't run through the streets waving charts. It doesn't even knock. It just sits there, usually in a government building, usually very well dressed, usually staring at a line on a graph that is doing something deeply unsettling. That line is going down, not dramatically, not falling off a cliff, just gently, politely, at a perfectly reasonable angle. And nothing scares a government quite like a gently declining line, because explosions can be blamed on something. Wars have enemies, crises have villains, but a slow, steady downward trend has no one to yell at. You can't declare war on a slope. Somewhere in a quiet office, someone clears their throat and says something like, "So, if this continues," and the room goes silent. Because everyone knows what comes next, and no one wants to say it out loud. This is how panic starts. Not with fire, but with spreadsheets. For most of human history, nobody worried about birth rates. People were mostly worried about things like food, weather, animals, and other people trying to kill them. Babies happened whenever they felt like it, often inconveniently, sometimes heroically, usually without permission. But modern states are different. Modern states count things. And once you start counting something, you start caring about it in ways that are deeply unhealthy. At first, counting people felt harmless. It was administrative, boring, a little nosy, but manageable. How many people live here? Roughly how many children? Who owes taxes? Normal questions, reasonable questions, but then someone did something dangerous. They compared the numbers. And that's when the trouble started, because comparisons invite judgment. And judgment invites anxiety. The first moment someone noticed that there were fewer babies this year than last year. Nothing happened. They shrugged. People shrugged a lot back then. The second year, someone wrote a memo. The memo was ignored. The third year, the memo got a graph. The fourth year, the graph got a meeting. By the fifth year, the meeting had coffee and a sense of dread. This is the part nobody notices from the outside. There is no announcement, no press conference, just a slow realization spreading through offices that something fundamental might be changing, not collapsing, not ending, just changing. And that is much worse, because change has no clear instructions. A falling birth rate doesn't feel like a disaster. It feels like a question, and governments hate unanswered questions. They love rules. They love thresholds. They love being able to say, below this number, bad, above this number, good. But birth rates refuse to behave like that. They drift. They hesitate. They wobble. They refuse to look urgent until suddenly everyone agrees they should have been worried earlier. This is where math enters quietly, like someone who didn't mean to be noticed. Not equations, not symbols, just arithmetic, counting births, dividing by population, comparing years, very innocent stuff. But once you divide something by something else, you've created a rate. And rates are dangerous. Rates suggest a momentum, and momentum suggests a future, and futures make people uncomfortable. A government can handle almost anything except the idea that the future might be different from the plan. The panic doesn't come from the numbers themselves, it comes from imagining them continuing. Because the simplest sentence in all of mathematics is also the most terrifying one. If this continues. That sentence has ended more meetings than any other phrase in history. If this continues, the workforce shrinks. If this continues, the tax base erodes. If this continues, there are more grandparents than grandchildren. No one ever finishes the sentence with anything cheerful. No one says, if this continues, everyone gets a nap. The fear is never about babies. Not really. It's about systems. Modern societies are delicate machines built on assumptions. Assumptions like there will be more people tomorrow than today, or at least roughly the same. When that assumption cracks, everything starts to feel unstable. Pension systems look nervous. Schools look lonely. Entire industries start imagining empty parking lots. And again, none of this is loud. It's just quiet concern spreading from department to department like a polite rumour. The irony is that the math itself is calm. Birth rates do not shout. They do not threaten. They simply exist. They are a ratio, a number with decimals. often too many decimals. And yet, entire national conversations can hinge on whether that decimal starts with a 1 or a 2. This is where the real unease begins. Because once you see the number, you cannot unsee it. Every year becomes a checkpoint. Every update a small emotional event. Someone refreshes a dataset. Someone else sighs. No one claps. What makes this panic especially strange is that it has no villain. Nobody is doing anything wrong. People are just living their lives. They're working longer, waiting longer, thinking longer, and math is sitting there quietly saying, yes, this is consistent, which is possibly the rudest thing math can say. Consistency is comforting when things are good. It is horrifying when they are not. So governments begin to worry. Not dramatically, just enough to start asking questions. And questions lead to models, and models lead to expectations. And expectations lead to disappointment. This entire story begins not with collapse, but with mild discomfort, a sense that something important is slightly off, a feeling that the numbers are trying to tell a story, and no one is sure they like the ending. The panic nobody talks about is quiet because it has no conclusion. There is no deadline, no countdown clock, just a line drifting downward, daring someone to say what it means. And in the absence of certainty, imagination takes over, which, historically, has never helped anyone calm down. This is how a global conversation starts. Not with shouting, but with a chart, a coffee, and someone saying, we should probably keep an eye on this. And they do, very closely, for years. When counting babies became a national obsession, it didn't happen all at once. No one woke up one morning and said, today we obsess over infants. It crept in slowly, wearing a badge and holding a clipboard. For most of history, babies were not statistics. They were events. Sometimes surprises, sometimes problems, sometimes extra hands for farming, sometimes extra mouths that made everyone nervous. But they were not numbers. Early societies counted people the same way they counted sheep, approximately, hopefully, with a strong belief that being wrong didn't matter much. Kings wanted to know how many men they could send to war. Tax collectors wanted to know how many people they could annoy. Religious leaders wanted to know how many souls were on the list. No one was checking spreadsheets for trends. Early population counts were more like vibes than data. Someone would walk through a town, ask a few questions, make some marks and leave. If the number was off by a few hundred, that was fine. Everyone assumed people moved around, disappeared, or lied anyway. Accuracy was not the goal. Control was. The idea that children themselves could be measured, tracked, and compared across years came much later, and it came with paperwork. Once states became more organized, they discovered something unsettling. Babies were predictable. Not individually, but collectively. You could never predict which family would have a child, but across an entire country, patterns emerged, and patterns are irresistible. Once you see a pattern, you start believing it means something. Birth counts slowly shifted from curiosity to concern, from interesting to important. Because children are not just children to a state, they are future workers, future soldiers, future taxpayers. And once you realize that, every birth becomes a tiny economic event. This is when babies stopped being babies and started becoming inputs. No one said this out loud, of course. It would have sounded terrible. Instead, they said things like demographic trends and long-term planning, much nicer. Early national censuses tried to be precise. They failed, spectacularly. People forgot relatives, added imaginary ones, moved during the count, refused to answer, answered twice. Some were counted as alive years after they had died. Others were never counted at all. But the numbers were printed anyway, because once a number exists, it gains authority simply by existing. The early data was messy, contradictory and incomplete, which made it perfect enough to be taken seriously. This is how children slowly became rows in tables. Someone noticed that one year had more births than the last. Someone else noticed a drop. And suddenly, birth counts were no longer just information. They were signals. Governments began asking questions that would have sounded absurd a century earlier. Why are there fewer babies this year? What changed? What did we do wrong? These are dangerous questions because they assume someone is in control. They assume that birth rates are levers you can pull. But at the time, this wasn't obvious. To early administrators, everything looked controllable. Taxes were controlled. Borders were controlled. Laws were controlled. Why not births? This is when math quietly tightened its grip. Not advanced math. Just counting over time. Lists turned into tables. Tables turned into time series. And time series tell stories whether you want them to or not. They tell stories about rise and decline, about momentum, about destiny. The moment someone drew the first birth rate graph, something irreversible happened, because graphs feel honest. A graph doesn't argue. It doesn't shout. It just shows. And people trust what they can see. A falling line feels like failure, even if nothing is actually failing. Early officials didn't fully understand what they were looking at, but they understood one thing clearly. This mattered. Birth rates stopped being background information and became performance indicators. If the number went up, someone felt proud. If it went down, someone felt uneasy. Children had become metrics. This obsession grew stronger as states became more complex. Industrialization made long-term planning necessary. Factories needed workers. Armies needed recruits. Cities needed residents. Suddenly, the future population wasn't just philosophical. It was logistical. How many schools do we build? How many jobs will exist? How many people will need food? All of these questions quietly depended on babies, and so the counting intensified. Censuses became more frequent, more detailed, more confident, even when they were still wrong, especially when they were still wrong. Because precision creates the illusion of understanding. By the time governments realized how unreliable early birth data was, it was too late. They had already built systems around it. Budgets, forecasts, plans. No one wanted to hear that the numbers were shaky. It's very hard to uncare about a number once you've cared too much. This is also when comparison entered the scene. Not just across time, but across borders. Who has more babies? Who has fewer? Who is doing better? Nothing turns a statistic into an obsession faster than competition. Birth rates became a subtle scoreboard. No prizes, just anxiety. And again, none of this felt dramatic at the time. It felt responsible. Counting babies wasn't about panic yet. It was about order, about being modern, about being informed. But the moment children became something you could graph, they also became something you could lose. And that idea never really went away. Once a society starts measuring its future in births per year, it can never fully relax, because numbers have memories. They remind you what you used to have, and they hint at what you might not. This is how counting babies stopped being neutral. It became emotional, and emotional math is where all the interesting mistakes begin. By the time people noticed the obsession had gone too far, the obsession felt normal. Birth rates were now headlines, talking points, policy triggers, and everyone forgot how strange that would have sounded to their ancestors, who would have been far too busy just surviving to worry about trends. But now the trends existed, and once they existed, they demanded attention, quietly, persistently, waiting for someone to ask what they meant, and whether something should be done about them. The strange idea that a nation can run out of people sounds ridiculous at first. Nations don't run out of people. They run out of money, or patience, or coffee. But people feel infinite. They feel like something that just keeps happening. And yet, once birth rates became numbers, someone eventually did the unthinkable. They imagined the number reaching zero, not tomorrow, not dramatically, just eventually. This is where math stopped being administrative and became existential. Because a nation is not just land and laws. It is people agreeing to keep showing up. When the numbers suggested fewer people might show up in the future, something snapped. Suddenly, population wasn't just a statistic, it was identity. A country with fewer people felt smaller, weaker, less important. Even if nothing had actually changed yet. This is how the idea of running out of people was born, not as a literal prediction, but as a feeling, a quiet fear that the future might be emptier than the past. Early models showed declining birth rates continuing forward, year after year, like a calm conveyor belt heading somewhere uncomfortable, and while no one truly believed a country would wake up one day completely empty, the imagination did the rest of the work. Empty schools, closed hospitals, silent playgrounds, entire cities that still existed but felt like echoes. This wasn't math anymore. This was storytelling. Bad storytelling. The dangerous part was that the numbers didn't argue back. They didn't say, people might change their behaviour. They didn't say culture matters. They didn't say history rarely moves in straight lines. They just kept going, down. And humans are very bad at watching something decline without inventing an ending. At this point, population became symbolic. A large population meant strength. A growing population meant vitality. A shrinking one meant decay. These ideas weren't written into any equation, but they were quietly assumed everywhere. Countries started comparing themselves not just to neighbours, but to their own past. We used to have more. That sentence alone can destabilise an entire conversation. Because once the past becomes a benchmark, the present always feels inadequate. This is also where confusion crept in. Population is not the same as a nation. A country doesn't disappear because fewer babies are born. Borders don't dissolve. Buildings don't vanish. And yet on paper, it can look that way. On paper, a shrinking population feels like a shrinking country. The map stays the same size, but the dots representing people start spreading out. More space between them. That visual alone is enough to make people uncomfortable. Empty space is unsettling. We associate it with abandonment, with loss. Math never intended this metaphor. Humans added it for free. As birth rates declined in some places, older fears resurfaced. Who will work? Who will care for the old? Who will keep things running? These are valid questions, but they quickly slide into something darker. Who are we becoming? This is where the panic quietly deepened. Because the fear wasn't extinction. Not really. It was irrelevance. A nation with fewer people feared being ignored, outpaced, outnumbered. Population became tangled up with power. Historically, large populations meant large armies, large economies, large influence. So a declining birth rate wasn't just a demographic issue. It felt like a loss of standing. And that feeling doesn't respond well to calm explanations. The math itself remained boring. Ratios, counts, projections. But the interpretations grew dramatic. People began talking about demographic winters and population cliffs, none of which exist mathematically, but they exist emotionally. The phrase running out of people is particularly interesting because it treats humans like a resource. Oil, coal, water, finite, consumable, which is deeply strange considering people are also the ones doing the consuming. This contradiction was rarely addressed. Instead, attention stayed on the imagined endpoint, the last classroom, the last factory shift, the last generation. These images are compelling. They are also misleading. Math does not predict silence. It predicts uncertainty. But uncertainty is hard to sell, especially compared to the idea of an empty future. Some countries took this idea very seriously. They began to imagine themselves fading, not violently, just slowly. A gentle dimming. This is where philosophy crept in without being invited. What makes a nation a nation? Is it territory, language, culture? Or is it simply the number of people willing to call it home? Math had accidentally asked a question it could not answer, and everyone noticed. The fear of running out of people was never about the math being wrong. It was about the math being too simple, because simple projections ignore resilience. They ignore adaptation. They ignore the inconvenient habit humans have of changing plans. But simplicity is comforting. A straight line feels honest, even when it isn't. The strange thing is that even as these fears spread, daily life remained unchanged. Cities were still busy. Hospitals were still full. Life continued. which made the panic feel abstract, like worrying about a storm that might arrive decades from now. You can't run from it. You can only talk about it. And talk they did. Birth rates became symbols of decline in conversations that had very little to do with children. They were about meaning, continuity, legacy. Math had become a mirror, and some societies didn't like what they thought they saw. The idea that a nation could run out of people stuck not because it was accurate, but because it was memorable. It gave shape to a vague unease. It turned slow change into a story with an ending. And once an ending exists, panic feels justified. This is how a numerical trend transformed into an existential fear, not through equations, but through imagination. The numbers themselves never said a nation would vanish. They simply kept counting. And humans, as always, filled in the silence with meaning, sometimes far more meaning than the math ever intended. The simplest population model is so simple that it almost feels insulting. You take a number, you watch how it changes, and then you assume it keeps doing that. That's it. No genius required, no advanced mathematics, just optimism and a ruler. This model has ruined many perfectly calm afternoons. The logic is straightforward. If births went down this year, and also went down last year, then maybe they will go down next year too. And if they keep going down, then eventually something uncomfortable happens. The model does not say when, it does not say how, it just gestures vaguely toward the future and shrugs. If this continues, those 3 words carry more emotional weight than any equation ever written. What makes this model so powerful is that it feels obvious. Humans love obvious things. A straight line is comforting. It suggests order. It suggests predictability. It suggests that the world is not trying to trick you. Unfortunately, the world loves tricking people. Early population projections were often drawn with literal straight lines. Someone took a pencil, connected 2 dots, and extended the line forward. No adjustment, no hesitation, just confidence. The future apparently was linear. This worked beautifully for short periods of time, which is the worst possible outcome. Because when something works briefly, people trust it forever. The problem with straight-line thinking is not that it is stupid, it's that it is lazy. It assumes that humans behave like machines, that decisions repeat, that culture freezes. It assumes that nothing interrupts the trend, no wars, no inventions, no social shifts, no surprises. In other words, it assumes history stops. This assumption rarely survives contact with reality. But on paper it looks excellent. The simplicity of the model made it seductive to governments. You could show it to anyone. You didn't need to explain much. This line goes down, you say. Everyone nods. No one asks why the line went down. They just stare at where it's going. This is where fear enters. Because once a line points somewhere unpleasant, people feel obligated to respond, even if the line is lying. Extrapolation feels responsible. It feels cautious. It feels like planning. But extrapolation is really just guesswork, dressed in confidence. It assumes that tomorrow will look like yesterday, which history has repeatedly proven to be a terrible assumption. Still, the model spread. It appeared in reports, briefings, forecasts, sometimes with disclaimers, usually ignored. The phrase "based on current trends" quietly disappeared. The future was treated as an extension of the present. This is how a gentle decline became a looming crisis. The model didn't predict catastrophe. People did. They looked at the line and imagined everything attached to it. Schools closing, workforces shrinking, entire systems creaking under demographic weight. The math itself said none of this. It just said the number changed. But humans are excellent at turning change into doom. The humour, if there is any, lies in what the model assumes about people. It assumes that no one reacts, that faced with declining birth rates, humans simply shrug and continue exactly as before. No policy changes, no cultural shifts, no adaptation. This would be impressive if it were true. In reality, humans respond constantly, sometimes too much, sometimes poorly, but never not at all. The straight line model also assumes that every decision is independent, that each year's birth rate is unrelated to the last, which is strange considering everyone keeps reacting to it. The model assumes people do not read headlines, do not feel pressure, do not change plans. It assumes an emotionally neutral society, which has never existed. Still, the model persisted because it was easy, and easy models travel far. They fit in presentations, they fit in headlines, they fit in worried minds at 3 in the morning. Complex models rarely cause panic. Simple ones do. The danger was not that the model was used, the danger was that it was believed as destiny. Once people accepted the idea that birth rates followed a simple path, the future felt sealed. This created a sense of urgency that the math itself did not justify, because linear trends rarely stay linear. They bend, they stall, they reverse, but bends are harder to explain than straight lines, and explanations slow down panic. At this stage, the model began shaping behavior, not the other way around. Policies were discussed as if the line were inevitable. We must act now, someone would say, pointing at a projection that assumed no one ever acted. The irony was rarely noticed. The model also quietly ignored scale. A small change looks dramatic when extended over decades. A slight dip becomes a cliff if you stretch it far enough. This stretching is visually impressive. It is also misleading. But visuals are persuasive. A graph extending into the future feels like prophecy. People forget that it is just math continuing a habit. The straight line model caused fear, not because it was complex, but because it was relatable. Everyone understands lines. Everyone understands downward. It didn't feel like math. It felt like common sense, which is always dangerous. Common sense has a long history of being wrong. The calm cruelty of the model is that it never admits uncertainty. It does not say maybe. It says if, and people treat if as will. By the time more nuanced models arrived, the emotional damage was done. The story had been written. The nation was shrinking. The future was thinning. And all of this came from a model that quietly assumed humans never change their minds, which, if nothing else, should have been a red flag. The simplest population model didn't cause panic because it was precise. It caused panic because it was neat. It fit into a single image, and once fear fits into an image, it spreads easily. The model was never meant to predict the end. It was meant to explore a possibility. But possibilities, once taken seriously, have a way of becoming expectations. This is how a pencil line on paper grew into a national concern, not because the math was shouting, but because it was too calm to question, and that calmness made it terrifying, because calm math feels certain, even when it isn't. When governments discovered the power of a graph, everything changed, not because the math improved, but because the fear became visible. Before graphs, numbers were quiet. They sat in tables. They hid in reports. They required effort. Graphs removed the effort. A graph does the thinking for you. It points, it suggests, it implies urgency without saying a word. You don't need to understand math to understand a line going down. Down is bad, up is good. This is not mathematics, this is instinct. The moment birth data was turned into a visual story, policy stopped being abstract. Now it had a shape. Someone could stand in front of a room, point at a slide and say nothing. The room would understand. That slide did more work than any speech ever could. Graphs feel honest because they look neutral. No opinions, no emotions, just data, which makes them extremely persuasive when emotions are involved. A downward arrow does not argue. It accuses, it suggests failure without naming anyone responsible, which is perfect for panic, because panic prefers vague blame. Governments love tools that simplify complexity. Graphs do this beautifully. They compress millions of lives into a single curve. They remove context. They remove noise. They remove stories. What's left feels clean, and clean things feel trustworthy. The trouble began when graphs started showing up everywhere, not just in internal reports but in presentations meant to convince ministers, committees, advisors. Everyone was shown the same image, a line, sloping downward. The reaction was predictable. Silence first, then concern, then questions like, why didn't we notice this earlier? The graph had given the impression that the problem had been obvious all along, which of course it hadn't. Before the graph, the numbers were messy. They fluctuated, they contradicted each other. The graph smoothed them out. Smoothing is a dangerous thing. It removes inconvenience. It turns irregular human behavior into something that looks mechanical, and machines, once broken, are expected to be fixed. The graph suggested control. If a line is falling, surely someone should lift it. This is where politics entered fully. A graph does not say what to do, but it strongly suggests that something must be done. And in government, something is rarely subtle. Policies were discussed not in terms of people, but in terms of curves. How do we bend this upward? How do we stop the decline? The graph had become the goal. This is a strange moment, because graphs describe reality. They do not create it. But once decisions are made to satisfy the graph starts shaping reality in return. This feedback loop is deeply uncomfortable. It gives the illusion that the math is in charge. In reality, humans are reacting to pictures. PowerPoint deserves a brief mention here, because PowerPoint changed everything. It turned data into performance. It allowed fear to be rehearsed. A single slide could be shown again and again, slowly gaining authority with each appearance. This again, someone would say, and everyone would nod. Repetition creates legitimacy. Eventually, no one remembered where the graph came from, only that it mattered. This is how visual math becomes policy. The simplicity of a graph hides its assumptions, timescale, smoothing method, data selection, all invisible, all forgotten. What remained was the emotional response, and emotions do not wait for peer review. The graph did something subtle but powerful. It made the future feel immediate. A projection extending 30 years ahead looks close when it's drawn in the same space as last year. Distance collapses on a slide. 30 years becomes a glance. This made long-term demographic shifts feel urgent in a way they had never felt before. A slow change suddenly felt like a crisis unfolding right now. And crisis invites action. Graphs also created comparison. One line next to another. One country versus another. One region falling faster than its neighbour. This was not helpful, but it was motivating. Nothing fuels policy like the idea that someone else is doing better, or worse, depending on the mood. At this stage, graphs stopped being informational and started becoming persuasive tools. They weren't used to ask questions. They were used to justify answers. Look, someone would say, we can't ignore this. And no one could, because ignoring a graph feels irresponsible. It feels like ignoring reality. Even when the graph is a simplification of a simplification, the irony is that the graph did not care. It did not panic. It did not demand. It just existed. But humans filled in the gaps. They imagined futures. They imagined consequences. They imagined blame. This is where policy discussions took on a strange urgency. Not because something catastrophic had happened, but because the graph made it feel inevitable. Once something feels inevitable, people rush to be seen responding. Graphs are excellent at creating inevitability. They make uncertainty look smooth. They make chaos look orderly. They make guesses look precise. And precision is seductive. The visual clarity gave birth rate discussions a seriousness they had not had before, no longer abstract, now undeniable. The line was right there, downward, mocking. Governments began treating the graph as a problem to be solved, not a signal to be understood. This distinction matters, because solving a graph means changing the line. Understanding a graph means questioning it. Most people chose the first option. It felt more active, more responsible, more decisive. The graph also changed who was listened to. Those who could produce clean visuals gained influence. Those who spoke in uncertainty lost it. Graphs dislike nuance. They reward confidence, and confidence, when paired with a declining line, looks like leadership. This is how visual math quietly reshaped decision-making, not through brilliance, but through clarity. A simple image outperformed complex reasoning, because images stick. They linger. They haunt. The birth rate graph became a character in its own story, a silent antagonist, always there, always pointing down, waiting for someone to do something. And once that happened, the conversation shifted permanently, no longer about whether change was happening, but about how fast and how scared everyone should be. The discovery of the graph did not cause the birth rate panic, but it gave it a face. And once panic has a face, it becomes very difficult to look away, because even when the numbers pause, even when they fluctuate, that image remains, burned into memory, a gentle line going down, quietly asking what you plan to do about it. The birth rate numbers that started policy experiments did not look dramatic at first. They were not shocking. They were not catastrophic. They were just disappointing. Slightly below expectations. Slightly below hopes. And that was enough, because once numbers fail to meet expectations, people assume something has gone wrong. This is when governments stopped observing and started experimenting, quietly, at first. Small incentives, polite encouragement. Nothing too strange. The logic felt reasonable. If people are having fewer children, maybe they just need a little help, or a little push, or a little reminder that the nation would really appreciate more babies, please. This is how policy met arithmetic, and it was awkward. The first experiments were gentle. Tax breaks, child benefits, extended leave, all framed as support. No one wanted to admit they were trying to manipulate birth rates. That would sound unsettling. Instead, the language was comforting, family-friendly, supportive, forward-looking. The math, however, was impatient. Policymakers expected results, not immediately. But soon, a bump, a pause, anything that suggested the line had noticed their efforts. It rarely did. This caused confusion. From a mathematical perspective, the expectation made sense. If you reduce the cost of something, demand should increase. That's basic economics. But children are not consumer goods. They do not respond predictably to discounts. You cannot put a baby on sale and expect demand to spike. This realization arrived slowly. Early policy reports were optimistic. They highlighted tiny changes, marginal improvements, short-term fluctuations. Anything that looked like progress was celebrated. Graphs were adjusted, time frames shortened. Hope was graphed aggressively, but then the numbers settled back into their old habits. The line resumed its gentle descent. This is where panic quietly sharpened, because once you try something and it doesn't work, the problem feels more serious. It's no longer a trend, it's resistance. Governments began to feel personally ignored by the data. This led to more ambitious experiments, bigger incentives, more publicity. Entire campaigns built around the idea that having children was a civic duty. Posters appeared, slogans were invented. Some were sincere, some were deeply uncomfortable. All were rooted in the same assumption, that people were waiting for permission, or encouragement, or money. But the math kept refusing to cooperate. The strange thing is that the policies were not unreasonable. Many of them genuinely helped families. They reduced stress, improved quality of life. They just didn't produce the expected numerical response. Because birth rates are not controlled by single variables. They are shaped by timing, expectations, culture. And culture does not respond to incentives on a quarterly schedule. This mismatch between political urgency and demographic reality created tension. Officials wanted movement. The math wanted patience. Patience is not popular in policy. Budgets have cycles. Elections have deadlines. Birth rates have none of that. They operate on human timescales, which are inconveniently long. Some policies were introduced with great fanfare, announced as turning points, as proof that the government was taking action. Years later, they were quietly discontinued, not because they failed outright, but because they failed to satisfy the graph. The graph had become the judge. and the graph was unimpressed. This led to a subtle shift in tone, from encouragement to concern, from support to urgency. Policy documents began using stronger language. Words like crisis started appearing more frequently, not because the situation had suddenly changed, but because patience had run out. The math was still doing what it had always done, counting, comparing, refusing to react emotionally. But the humans interpreting it were running out of calm explanations. This is when experimentation became less careful. Some ideas were rushed. Some were based more on hope than evidence. When fear enters, rigor often exits quietly. The pressure to do something grew, and when the thing you're trying to change doesn't move, you start questioning the people. Why aren't they responding? Why aren't they behaving as expected? This is a dangerous question, because it assumes that people owe the numbers something, that they are failing a metric. The math never said this, but policies implied it. Birth rates became targets. Targets are meant to be hit, and when targets aren't hit, frustration follows. This frustration often took the form of short-term thinking. Policies designed to produce immediate effects. Quick wins. Headline-friendly results. Birth rates are immune to quick wins. They respond slowly, if at all. They reflect decisions made years earlier, decisions about education, careers, housing. You cannot fix that with a single budget line. But the math did not explain this loudly. It simply waited. The gap between expectation and reality widened. Governments expected curves to bend. The curves remained stubbornly calm. This calmness was infuriating. It felt passive-aggressive. The numbers weren't crashing. They weren't improving. They were just continuing, which is the worst possible outcome when you're trying to prove that action matters. This is how policy experiments multiplied. Different approaches, different incentives, all hoping to be the one that finally made the graph blink. Some worked briefly, a small uptick here, a pause there, celebrated enthusiastically, then faded. The math always returned to its long-term pattern. This wasn't because the policies were useless. Many improved lives, but improving lives and changing demographic trends are not the same thing. This distinction was often lost. The obsession with birth rate numbers turned complex social realities into a single score, and when that score refused to change, anxiety grew. Not because the future was doomed, but because control felt elusive. Policy experiments revealed an uncomfortable truth that some numbers cannot be commanded. They can only be observed, and observation is unsatisfying when panic demands action. The birth rate panic deepened, not because governments did nothing, but because they did many things, and the math barely noticed, which felt, to those watching the graphs, like a kind of quiet defiance. The numbers did not rise to meet expectations. They simply continued being what they were, and in that silence the panic learned a new lesson. That changing human behavior is not as easy as changing a policy, no matter how confident the graph looks, no matter how urgent the meeting feels. Some trends are not waiting to be fixed. They are waiting to be understood, and understanding takes time, which math is very good at, and panic is very bad at. Why people refuse to behave like the math expected is the part that surprised everyone except the people themselves. From the perspective of a model, things were very simple. Costs go down, support goes up, birth rates respond. That's how it works with many things. Fuel prices, train tickets, streaming subscriptions, lower the barrier, increase participation. So when the same logic was applied to children, the expectation felt reasonable, and yet people stubbornly refused to cooperate, not out of protest, not out of spite. They just kept making decisions that made sense to them. This is where the models began to feel personally attacked. The math had assumed a certain kind of human, a calm human, a rational human, a human with free time, spare money, and a flexible sense of the future. This human exists almost nowhere. Real people make decisions based on fear, hope, exhaustion, and timing, none of which fit neatly into a formula. The models treated children as outcomes. People treated them as life-altering events. This difference matters. From a spreadsheet's point of view, having a child is a number changing by 1. From a human's point of view, it is a permanent restructuring of existence. The math did not fully appreciate this. It assumed that if conditions improved, decisions would follow, but conditions are not just financial. They are emotional, cultural, psychological, and these are much harder to graph. People delayed having children, not because incentives were insufficient, but because life felt uncertain. Uncertainty does not respond well to bonuses. You cannot bribe someone into confidence. The math also assumed consistency, that people would respond similarly across regions, cultures, and generations. This was optimistic. In reality, the same policy produced wildly different outcomes in different places, because people are not interchangeable. They bring histories with them, expectations passed down through families, ideas about what a good life looks like. The models flattened all of this into averages. Averages are polite. They smooth over disagreement, but they also hide resistance. The math expected behavior to change first. In reality, beliefs change first, and beliefs move slowly. People watched the same graphs. Governments watched. They saw headlines. They heard about declines and crises. And instead of reacting by having more children, many reacted by becoming more cautious, which the models did not predict. Fear does not always produce action. Sometimes it produces delay. Delay looks identical to refusal from a statistical distance. This confused policymakers. Why, after so much effort, were the numbers still unmoved? The answer was uncomfortable. The models had misunderstood motivation. They assumed that people wanted the same things they used to want. But societies change. Goals shift. Having children used to be woven into survival. Now it competes with education, careers, personal fulfillment, and rest. The math treated these as minor variables. People treated them as priorities. Another problem was timing. The models assumed that decisions respond quickly to policy changes. But most decisions about having children are made years in advance. They are influenced by childhood experiences, by housing markets, by job stability, by whether someone feels like the future is welcoming. You cannot rush that with a press release. The math wanted feedback. People needed reassurance. These are not the same thing. This mismatch created frustration. From the model's point of view, nothing made sense. From the human point of view, everything did. The model said, "Here is support." People said, "We're still tired." The model said costs are lower. People said, "Life is still complicated." The model said, "This should work." People said nothing. And silence is hard to interpret statistically. The phrase "people refuse to behave" is misleading. People behaved exactly like people. It was the expectation that was wrong. The math had mistaken correlation for control. It saw patterns in the past and assumed they could be replicated. But those patterns were tied to specific moments in history, moments that no longer existed: post-war optimism, economic expansion, clear life paths. You cannot recreate these with subsidies. The models did not account for choice overload. Modern life offers more options than ever. More paths, more timelines. When there are many possible futures, committing to one feels risky. Birth rates reflect that hesitation. The math interpreted hesitation as a problem. People experienced it as caution. This is where the tone of discussion began to change. Instead of asking, "What do people need?" the question became, "Why aren't they responding?" This is a subtle shift. It moves responsibility away from systems and onto individuals. The math never asked for this shift, but interpretations did. Some commentators began framing low birth rates as a failure of values or priorities, or commitment. These explanations were emotionally satisfying. They were also mathematically lazy. The models had no way to measure fulfillment, anxiety, or hope, so they ignored them, and then acted surprised when the results didn't match expectations. People also responded to the pressure itself. Being told that you should have children because the numbers demand it is not inspiring. It is unsettling. It turns a personal decision into a public obligation. The math did not intend this, but the messaging did. This created resistance, quiet resistance, the kind that looks like inaction, which models interpret as failure. Another flaw was assuming that birth rates are independent decisions. They are not. People talk, they observe, they imitate. If peers delay having children, that delay spreads. Not as ideology, as normalization. The math treated each decision as isolated. Culture treated them as shared. This made prediction extremely difficult, because culture does not move linearly. It shifts suddenly, often without warning. The refusal to behave as expected revealed the limits of modeling human life. The math was not wrong. It was incomplete. It measured outcomes, not experiences. It tracked decisions, not reasons. This is not a failure of mathematics. It is a reminder of its boundaries. The panic grew partly because the math stayed calm while behavior did not conform. People do not like systems that fail silently. They prefer dramatic errors. The quiet mismatch between prediction and reality felt more disturbing than a clear mistake. The models did not explode. They just missed. Consistently. This taught an important lesson. That birth rates are not levers. They are reflections. Reflections of how safe people feel, how hopeful they are, how much space they believe the future has for them. You cannot command that with formulas. You can only observe it, and observation, once again, felt unsatisfying, because it offered no immediate fix, only understanding, which takes time and patience, and a willingness to accept that some numbers are not waiting to be optimized. They are waiting to be listened to, even when they refuse to say what you want them to say. The countries that tried to fix birth rates with money did so with great optimism. Money feels concrete, reliable, comforting. If something is broken, money is usually the first thing people throw at it. And to be fair, this works surprisingly often. Roads improve, hospitals expand, problems shrink. So when birth rates refused to move, it seemed reasonable to try cash. Not as bribery, of course. That would sound crude. This was support, encouragement, a gentle financial nudge in the right direction. The idea was simple. If raising children is expensive, make it less expensive. If people are worried about money, remove the worry. The math liked this idea. It fit nicely into existing models, reduce cost, increase activity, a neat transaction. What followed was a wave of policies that treated money as motivation, monthly payments, lump sums, tax credits, sometimes all three. In some places, families received bonuses for each child. In others, benefits increased with family size. The logic was clear. More children, more support. What could go wrong? At first, the results looked promising. Small increases, short-term bumps. Graphs twitched upward. Meetings were optimistic again. Reports used words like encouraging and early signs. Hope returned, briefly. Then something familiar happened. The numbers settled. The bumps flattened. The lines resumed their slow, indifferent movement. It wasn't that the money had no effect. It clearly helped. Families felt less pressure. Children were better supported. But the effect on birth rates was smaller than expected, and shorter-lived. This confused everyone. From the model's perspective, the input had changed. So the output should have changed too, but real life had added extra variables without permission. Housing costs, job insecurity, time. Time was the most stubborn variable of all. Money cannot buy time. And time, it turns out, is a major factor in deciding whether to have children. People were working longer hours, commuting further, feeling constantly behind. A monthly payment does not create extra evenings. It does not create energy. The math had underestimated exhaustion. This was not intentional. Exhaustion is hard to quantify. There is no universal unit for being tired. Some countries tried to increase the incentives. Bigger payments, longer benefits. If some money didn't work, more money surely would. This logic is very persuasive, and sometimes correct. But again, the results were muted, because the decision to have children is not a purchase. It is a reorganization of life. No amount of cash changes that fundamental reality. Another problem emerged quietly. People began factoring the incentives into their planning, not as motivation, but as background. The money became expected, normal. It stopped feeling like encouragement and started feeling like compensation, and compensation rarely inspires enthusiasm. In some cases, incentives produce timing shifts rather than increases. People who were already planning to have children did so slightly earlier. The graph moved, but only temporarily. The math noticed this and became suspicious. Was this real change or borrowed time? The answer was usually the second. This is a deeply frustrating outcome for a model. It looks like success at first, then disappears, leaving behind confusion. Money-based policies also created strange comparisons. Which child deserved support? Which family qualified? The rules became complex. Complex rules produce uneven outcomes. Uneven outcomes produce resentment. Resentment is not helpful for long-term planning. In some countries, incentives were generous enough to attract international attention. Stories circulated. Have a baby here, get paid. These stories were exaggerated, but they shaped perception, and perception affects behavior, sometimes in unintended ways. The math had assumed rational response, but people also respond to stories. Some saw incentives as a sign of desperation. If a government is paying for babies, something must be wrong. This interpretation was not helpful. It made people more cautious, not less. Money also cannot address deeper concerns, questions about the future, about stability, about meaning. These are not line items in a budget. The math treated financial support as a dominant factor. In reality, it was just one of many, important but not decisive. Another limitation became clear over time. Incentives require maintenance. You cannot introduce them and walk away. They create expectations. Once benefits exist, removing them is politically dangerous. So governments found themselves locked into policies that did not deliver the desired effect, but could not be reversed. This was awkward. The math did not care. Budgets did. Some policymakers began to wonder if the problem was not the amount of money, but the form. Cash versus services, payments versus time off, childcare access, housing support. These approaches were more complex, harder to model, harder to explain. They did not produce clean graphs, which made them less attractive. Money produces numbers. Numbers produce charts. Charts produce confidence. This feedback loop favored financial incentives even when they underperformed. The math did not demand simplicity. Humans did. There was also a cultural blind spot. Money means different things in different places. In some societies, direct payments felt supportive. In others, they felt intrusive. The same policy had different meanings depending on context. The math ignored meaning. It counted outcomes. This led to inconsistent results that confused analysts. Why did the same incentive work here but not there? The answer was uncomfortable, because people are not the same everywhere. Their reasons are not interchangeable. Their fears are not universal. The math wanted general rules. Reality offered exceptions. Over time, enthusiasm for purely financial fixes cooled, not because they were useless, but because they were insufficient. They addressed symptoms, not causes, and symptoms, when treated alone, tend to return. The countries that tried to fix birth rates with money learned an important lesson, that numbers respond best to systems, not gestures, and money, when isolated, is a gesture, a meaningful one, but still a gesture. The panic did not fade. It simply changed shape. From "we need incentives" to "why isn't this enough?" This shift was subtle, but important. It marked the moment when people began to suspect that birth rates were reflecting something deeper, something not easily adjusted. The math, once again, remained calm. It recorded the outcomes. It showed the modest effects. It offered no commentary. And in that silence, policymakers were forced to confront a difficult possibility, that the problem was not a lack of money, but a lack of certainty. And certainty, unlike cash, cannot be distributed by policy. It has to be felt, which makes it very hard to model, and even harder to buy. The countries that relied on money learned that while financial support matters, it does not command. It supports, it helps, but it does not decide. And birth rates, it turns out, are decided quietly, in living rooms, in late conversations, in moments of doubt and hope, far away from spreadsheets, far away from budgets, and very far away from the comforting simplicity of a graph that promises control. The mistake of treating birth rates like gravity began innocently. Gravity is reliable. It behaves. It does not care about opinions, culture, or mood. Drop something and it falls. This kind of certainty is comforting. So when birth rates became numbers, some people began to treat them the same way, as forces, as laws, as things that simply happen unless acted upon. This comparison felt natural. After all, numbers feel objective, and objectivity feels like physics. But birth rates are not physics. They are closer to weather, or traffic, or fashion. They respond to conditions, not laws. The problem was that once birth rates were framed as forces, they invited forceful responses. If gravity pulls things down, you build a structure to resist it. If birth rates fall, you build a policy to push back. The metaphor felt neat. It was also wrong. Gravity does not care what you think. Birth rates care very much. They respond to expectations, to norms, to shared stories about what is normal. Gravity does not read headlines. People do. When birth rates were discussed as if they were natural forces, the conversation changed. It became fatalistic. If the rate is falling, it will keep falling. This sentence sounds scientific. It is not. It confuses momentum with destiny. The math did not say birth rates must fall forever, but the language used around them implied inevitability. This led to overconfidence. If something is inevitable, you stop questioning it. You stop asking what assumptions are baked into the model. You stop asking whether the trend depends on conditions that might change. You start treating projections as laws of nature. This is very convenient. It removes responsibility. If something behaves like gravity, there is nothing to debate. You just accept it. The mistake became clear when the same models failed in different contexts. In one country, a decline slowed. In another, it stalled. In a third, it reversed slightly. Gravity does not do this. It does not pause. It does not hesitate. It does not respond to policy. Birth rates do all of these things. But the gravity metaphor had already taken hold. So instead of questioning the metaphor, people questioned the people. Why are they acting differently here? Why are they not responding as expected? This is backwards. The expectation was wrong. Another problem with treating birth rates like gravity is that gravity operates smoothly. Birth rates do not. They jump, they dip, they wobble. They react to events, economic shocks, cultural shifts, pandemics. Gravity was unaffected by all of these. Birth rates were not. But models built on gravity-like assumptions smoothed out these disruptions. They treated them as noise, temporary deviations. The idea was that the true trend would reassert itself. This assumption often failed, because sometimes the disruption is the trend. The metaphor also encouraged long-term certainty. Gravity is predictable far into the future. Birth rates are not. Yet projections extended decades ahead were presented with confidence, as if human behavior obeyed the same equations as falling objects. This confidence was persuasive. It sounded scientific. It felt rigorous, but it rested on shaky ground. The math itself did not demand this certainty. The interpretation did. When people talk about demographic forces, they often mean patterns they don't fully understand. The word force makes ignorance sound inevitable. It suggests there is nothing to be done, or that only extreme measures will matter. Neither is helpful. Another issue was scale. Gravity works the same at small and large scales. Birth rates do not. Local culture matters. Urban and rural areas behave differently. Education levels matter. Housing markets matter. The gravity metaphor ignores all of this. It collapses complexity into inevitability. This made policy conversations strangely rigid. Instead of asking why, discussions focused on how much incentive, how much support, as if increasing force would counteract force. But birth rates are not opposing vectors. They are reflections. reflections of how people feel about their lives, about their futures, about their capacity to commit, treating them like gravity removed agency. It implied that people were passive objects being pulled by forces beyond their control. This is not how people experience their own decisions. The mismatch between lived experience and statistical framing created distrust. People did not recognize themselves in the models. They felt talked about, not understood. This mattered, because trust affects behavior. When people feel misunderstood, they disengage. Disengagement does not show up as protest. It shows up as silence, which looks like stability in data, but is not. The gravity metaphor also discouraged humility. If something behaves like a law of nature, questioning it feels pointless. This discouraged experimentation, not policy experiments, conceptual ones. Alternative explanations were sidelined. Cultural factors were acknowledged briefly, then ignored. They were harder to quantify, harder to graph. And gravity does not care about nuance. The irony is that math itself is not rigid. Good mathematics is cautious. It acknowledges uncertainty. It tests assumptions. The rigidity came from storytelling, from the need to explain trends simply. Birth rates are falling became a statement of fact rather than a description of a moment. This framing stuck, even when the data became more complicated, even when the lines flattened, even when different regions diverged. The idea of inevitability lingered. It shaped expectations, and expectations shaped decisions. This feedback loop made the gravity metaphor self-reinforcing. People expected decline, so they planned for decline. Planning for decline can contribute to decline. This is not gravity. This is psychology. The mistake was not using models. Models are useful. The mistake was forgetting what kind of models they were. Birth rate models describe tendencies, not laws. They summarize behavior. They do not command it. Treating them like physics removed the most important variable, choice. Choice is messy. It does not scale neatly. It does not follow clean curves. But it is the heart of demographic change. Once this mistake was recognized, quietly and slowly, the tone began to shift. Some analysts stopped talking about forces. They started talking about conditions, environments, contexts. These words are less dramatic. They do not inspire panic. They also do not fit easily into headlines, which made them less popular. But they were more accurate. Birth rates are not pulled down by gravity. They drift. They respond. They reflect. They are sensitive to stories people tell themselves about what kind of life is possible. This makes them harder to predict, but also less terrifying, because drift implies movement, and movement implies change, not collapse. The fear came from mistaking a tendency for a destiny, from treating a human pattern like a physical law. Once that confusion is cleared, the math becomes calmer, less accusatory, less dramatic, still important, but no longer pretending to be something it is not. The mistake of treating birth rates like gravity taught an important lesson, that numbers can describe without dictating, and that when we give them more authority than they deserve, we end up panicking over metaphors, not realities. The math never demanded gravity. We did, and gravity, it turns out, was a poor choice, because people are not objects, and their futures are not things that simply fall. When falling birth rates became a global story, something subtle but important happened. The numbers stopped belonging to individual countries. They became comparative, and comparison is where anxiety really learns to travel. At first, each country worried in isolation. Quiet meetings, internal reports, concerned footnotes. But then someone put the numbers next to each other, and suddenly everyone could see everyone else. This was not helpful, because the moment you compare, you create a ranking, and rankings turn trends into competitions. Who is falling fastest? Who is holding on? Who is doing better? None of these questions improve understanding. They do, however, increase panic. The global story did not begin with a dramatic announcement. It began with international reports, carefully worded, politely alarming. Phrases like shared challenge and global trend started appearing. These phrases sound calm. They are not. They suggest inevitability. If everyone is experiencing the same thing, it must be something big, something structural, something unstoppable. This is how local concerns became planetary ones. Birth rates were no longer just about national planning. They were about humanity. That escalation changed the tone. A falling line in one country can be explained away. A falling line everywhere feels existential. World maps became popular. Maps with colours, some bright, some dark, colours that quietly judged. A country in a darker shade looked like it was failing, even if nothing had changed for the people living there. The map did not show context. It showed contrast. Contrast creates drama. The global framing also encouraged sweeping statements. Developed countries are declining. The world is aging. Humanity is slowing down. These statements are vague enough to sound profound. They are also dangerously imprecise. They collapse wildly different experiences into a single narrative. The math did not require this simplification. The storytelling did. Once the story went global, every update felt significant. A small change in one region became a headline elsewhere. This country's birth rate hits new low. The word new did a lot of work. New sounds urgent, even when the change is tiny. The global story also created strange alliances. Countries with very different cultures found themselves grouped together. Not because they were similar, but because their numbers matched. This made the phenomenon feel universal, and universal problems feel harder to solve. The global framing encouraged the idea that something fundamental had shifted, that humanity itself was entering a new phase. This sounds dramatic. It also sounds unfixable. The math had not said this, but the scale of the conversation implied it. When something becomes global, responsibility becomes blurry. Who is supposed to act? Which country sets the example? Which policy becomes the template? This uncertainty fed the panic. Everyone waited for someone else to find the solution. Meanwhile, the numbers kept arriving, calmly, consistently. The global story also encouraged selective attention. Regions where birth rates stabilized were downplayed. Regions where they declined sharply were highlighted. Drama travels better than nuance. This distorted perception. It made the decline feel steeper and more uniform than it actually was. The math did not exaggerate. The storytelling did. Another effect of the global framing was comparison across time, not just between countries but between eras. People compared modern birth rates to historical ones, often without context, often without acknowledging that history included conditions no one wanted to return to. High birth rates in the past were linked to high child mortality, limited options, lack of control. These details were rarely emphasized. The global story preferred clean contrasts. Then versus now, up versus down. Simple narratives survive. Complex ones struggle. The phrase global birth rate decline became shorthand. It suggested a single cause, or at least a single direction. But global trends are rarely singular. Some places were declining, some were stabilizing, some were increasing. But averages smooth this out. Averages always smooth things out. They make the world feel simpler than it is. The global conversation also encouraged prediction. If the trend is global, then the future must be shared. This led to bold forecasts, big numbers, long timelines. Some predicted peak population. Others predicted long declines. These predictions were mathematically plausible. They were also fragile. Small changes in assumptions produced vastly different outcomes, but those assumptions were rarely discussed in public. They were buried in footnotes. The global story preferred confidence. Confidence sounds reassuring, even when it is misplaced. Media coverage amplified this effect. Headlines love global claims. They feel important. World population to shrink. This sentence is technically nuanced, but it reads like an ending. Endings attract attention. The nuance that population growth might slow before changing direction was lost. The idea that different regions might experience different futures was inconvenient. The global story wanted unity, not complexity. This is where fear spread fastest. Not because the situation was dire, but because the story suggested it was. The idea that everyone is facing the same issue makes it feel unavoidable. You cannot escape a global trend, or so it seems. This perception changed how people interpreted their own local data. A small decline felt larger when framed as part of a global movement. Local context faded. Global narratives took over. The math itself remained cautious. It spoke in ranges, in probabilities, in scenarios, but those words did not travel well. They were replaced with absolutes, with trends, with arrows. The global story also created pressure for alignment. If everyone is facing the same problem, solutions should look similar. This discouraged experimentation. Policies began copying each other, sometimes without regard for local conditions. The results were predictable, mixed. But mixed results do not make good global stories, so they were filtered out. The global framing also encouraged moral interpretations. If birth rates are falling everywhere, what does that say about modern life? About values? About priorities? These questions are philosophical, but they were often framed as mathematical conclusions, which they are not. The math describes what is happening. It does not explain why people feel the way they do. This distinction blurred, and when it blurs, panic thrives. The global story reached a point where it felt self-sustaining. Every new report reinforced the narrative. Every new chart confirmed what people already believed, that something was wrong, that something was slipping, even when the data was ambiguous. This is the danger of scale. Large stories drown out small corrections. The global framing made birth rates feel like a single lever controlling humanity's fate. This was never true, but it was compelling. And compelling stories are hard to unlearn. Eventually, some analysts began pushing back. They pointed out regional variation. They emphasized uncertainty. They cautioned against dramatic conclusions. These voices existed. They were just quieter. Because calm does not travel as far as concern. The global birth rate story did not create the panic, but it amplified it. It took individual anxieties and connected them. It turned scattered worries into a shared narrative. And shared narratives feel heavier, more real, more urgent. Even when they are built on simplifications, the irony is that humanity has always lived with uncertainty. What changed was visibility. The numbers became global, the graphs became shared, and the story became bigger than any single data set. The math never demanded a global panic. It simply allowed one. By making it possible to see everything at once, and humans, when shown the whole world in numbers, tend to imagine conclusions, sometimes darker than the data itself. This is how falling birth rates became a global story, not because they suddenly mattered more, but because they were finally visible everywhere at the same time. And visibility, once achieved, is very hard to turn off, especially when it points in a direction people already fear, quietly, persistently, across the entire map. The math behind replacement level sounds far more mysterious than it actually is. It is not a secret formula. It is not ancient knowledge. It is not even very exciting, which is exactly why it became so powerful. Replacement level is simply the idea that each generation should produce enough children to replace itself. Not grow, not shrink, just continue. On paper, this sounds comforting, balanced, stable, a neat handoff from one generation to the next. The number most often attached to this idea looks oddly specific, 2 point something. This decimal caused far more anxiety than it deserved. The number exists because not everyone survives to adulthood. Some people do not have children. Some leave, some arrive, so the average needs to be slightly above 2. This explanation is straightforward. Unfortunately, the number did not remain an explanation. It became a benchmark. Benchmarks invite judgment. Above replacement sounds healthy. Below replacement sounds dangerous. The math never said this, but the language did. Replacement level quietly turned into a moral line. Cross it and something is wrong. Stay above it and everything feels safe. This is a remarkable amount of pressure for a single decimal. The number itself is fragile. It depends on assumptions about mortality, migration and survival. Change those assumptions slightly and the number shifts. But this flexibility was rarely discussed. The number was presented as fixed, as natural, as if it were written somewhere permanent. This gave it authority. Once replacement level entered public conversation, it became shorthand. People stopped talking about trends. They talked about crossing a threshold. Thresholds feel decisive. They create drama. They suggest that something irreversible has happened. The moment a country's birth rate dipped below replacement, headlines appeared. It did not matter how small the dip was. It did not matter how temporary. Crossing the line was the story. This framing was misleading. Replacement level does not describe immediate consequences. It describes long-term tendencies. A population below replacement does not collapse. It slowly changes shape. But slow change is not exciting. Thresholds are. The math behind replacement level does not say anything about quality of life. It does not measure happiness, or stability, or resilience. It simply measures continuity. Yet the number was often treated as a verdict. Above it, optimism. Below it, concern. This binary interpretation ignored context. Countries with high migration could remain stable below replacement. Countries with changing family structures could adapt. Replacement level did not account for any of this, but the number did not need to. It had already become symbolic. The decimal point played a strange role. Decimals feel precise. They suggest rigor. They make statements sound scientific. 2 feels vague. 2.1 sounds deliberate. This psychological effect gave the number weight. People trusted it more because it was awkward. No one questioned why such a clean idea required such an inconvenient number. The number became sticky. Once introduced, it was repeated everywhere. Reports, articles, presentations. Eventually it felt obvious, as if it had always existed. But replacement level is not a natural law. It is a statistical construct. It summarizes a complex reality in a single figure, which is useful and dangerous. The danger came from treating replacement level as a goal rather than a description. Goals demand action. Descriptions invite understanding. The shift from description to goal was subtle, but significant. Policymakers began talking about returning to replacement, as if it were a destination, a place you could navigate to. This implied control, and control felt reassuring. But birth rates do not navigate. They emerge. They reflect choices. Replacement level also encouraged comparisons that were not meaningful. A country at 1.9 was treated as dramatically different from one at 2.1. In reality, these differences are minor, but the threshold made them feel enormous. Crossing the line carried emotional weight. This led to overreaction. Policies were justified not by outcomes, but by proximity to the number. "We are below replacement" became a conversation stopper. No further explanation required. The math was invoked as authority. This is not the math's fault. The math did not ask to be simplified. Humans did. Another misunderstanding was time. Replacement level operates over generations. It does not describe immediate futures. A population can remain stable for decades below replacement. Demographics have inertia. This was often ignored. The number was treated as an emergency signal, which it is not. The math never said, "act now." It said, "if conditions persist." Those words were lost. Replacement level also obscured internal variation. Different regions within a country could have very different birth rates. Different communities responded differently. The average hid this, but the threshold did not care. It judged the whole. This encouraged one-size-fits-all thinking, which rarely works. The number also interacted badly with fear. Once panic entered the conversation, replacement level became a warning sign, a cliff edge, a point of no return. This is fiction. There is no demographic cliff at replacement level. The graph does not drop off. It bends, slowly, quietly. The problem was never the math. It was the metaphor. Replacement level was treated like a minimum requirement, like a test score. Pass or fail. This framing ignored adaptation. Societies adapt constantly. They adjust work patterns, migration, technology. Replacement level does not account for these changes. It is a snapshot, not a prophecy. Despite this, the number continued to dominate discussions because it was easy to communicate, Because it sounded scientific, because it offered clarity in an uncertain conversation. Clarity is comforting, even when it is false. Some analysts tried to soften the narrative. They emphasized uncertainty. They explained the assumptions behind the number. These explanations rarely made headlines. They were too long, too careful. Replacement level thrived because it was simple. Simple ideas travel far, especially when they confirm existing fears. The irony is that replacement level was never meant to alarm. It was meant to explain, to help understand how populations maintain size. But once it entered public discourse, it was repurposed. It became a symbol of decline, of failure, of something needing to be fixed. This placed immense pressure on a single metric, more pressure than it could reasonably bear. Replacement level did not predict collapse. It did not demand panic. It quietly described a balance point. Humans turned it into a line in the sand, and lines in the sand invite conflict. They divide. They simplify. They make gradual change feel dramatic. The math behind replacement level is modest. It does not shout. It does not judge. It offers a way to think about continuity. What we do with that information is a separate matter. The panic surrounding replacement level was not caused by the number. It was caused by the meaning attached to it, meaning layered on top of math, meaning amplified by fear, meaning repeated until it felt inevitable. But inevitability is not a mathematical conclusion. It is a psychological one. Replacement level did not say the future was doomed. It said the future depends on conditions. That distinction mattered, and it was often forgotten. The decimal stayed, the panic grew, and the math remained quietly misunderstood, waiting, as it often does, for someone to read it a little more carefully, and a little less emotionally. The assumption that broke most population forecasts was so small that it almost went unnoticed. It usually appeared as a single sentence, sometimes half a sentence, often in parentheses, something like, assuming current trends continue. This assumption looked harmless, responsible even. You have to assume something. Math cannot move forward without at least one belief about the future. The problem was not the assumption itself. It was how casually it was treated. Current trends sounds neutral, objective, but trends are not objects. They are summaries of behavior, and behavior is sensitive. The assumption quietly stated that people would keep doing what they were doing, at roughly the same pace, in roughly the same way, for a very long time. This is a bold claim. History does not support it. Almost every long-term population forecast failed in the same way, not because the math was wrong, but because the assumption stayed frozen while the world moved. Trends are snapshots. They capture a moment. Extending them forward assumes that the conditions creating them remain unchanged. This rarely happens. Wars happen, technologies appear, cultural norms shift. None of these are rare events. They are the default state of history, yet population models often treated them as anomalies, temporary disruptions, noise. The assumption quietly insisted that after the noise, the trend would return. Sometimes it did. Often it didn't. This created forecasts that looked reasonable at the time and embarrassing later. Graphs aged poorly. Predictions were quietly revised, sometimes without explanation. The assumption also ignored feedback. People react to trends. They read headlines. They adjust expectations. They delay or accelerate decisions. This reaction changes the trend, which means the trend cannot be assumed to continue unchanged. The assumption erased this loop. It treated people as unaware of their own behavior, which is rarely true. The assumption also ignored learning. Societies learn. They adapt. They respond to incentives differently over time. What works once may not work again. The assumption treated response as static, as if once a pattern exists, it will repeat forever. This is comforting for modelling. It is disastrous for accuracy. Another issue was scale. Short-term trends are often driven by temporary factors, economic cycles, policy changes, cultural moments. Extending these into the future exaggerates their importance. A dip caused by a recession looks like a permanent decline if you stretch it far enough. The assumption did not distinguish between structural change and temporary shock. It treated everything as permanent. This made forecasts fragile. Small errors early became massive divergences later. A difference of a few decimal points compounded over decades. The result looked dramatic, but the drama was mathematical, not real. The assumption also encouraged overconfidence. If you believe trends continue, you can speak confidently about the future. Confidence is attractive, especially to policymakers. Uncertainty is harder to sell, so forecasts leaned towards certainty, even when the math did not justify it. The assumption became invisible. People forgot it was there. They treated the output as fact rather than conditional. If current trends continue, quietly became "this will happen." This shift was subtle, but crucial. It transformed possibilities into expectations. Expectations shape decisions, which then alter the trend. The assumption thus undermined itself. One of the most common forecasting failures involved fertility rebounds. Models predicted continued decline, then birth rates stabilized, or rose slightly. Analysts scrambled, explanations were offered, but the core issue remained. The assumption had failed, not because it was wrong to assume something, but because it was wrong to assume sameness. Sameness is rare, change is constant. The assumption also struggled with culture. Cultural shifts can happen quickly. Attitudes toward family, work, and identity evolve, sometimes over a generation, sometimes faster. Models did not incorporate this well. Culture was treated as background, not a driver. This was convenient. Culture is difficult to quantify. It resists neat equations, so it was often excluded. The assumption replaced culture with inertia, which was easier, but less accurate. Another breaking point was migration. Population forecasts often struggled to predict movement. Migration responds to opportunity, conflict, and policy. It can change rapidly. The assumption treated migration as stable, or secondary. This worked until it didn't. Sudden influxes or outflows disrupted forecasts. Again, the math was not wrong. The assumption was brittle. The assumption also failed to account for technology. Medical advances affect mortality. Communication changes norms. Work patterns shift life planning. These factors influence birth rates indirectly but powerfully. Models struggled to anticipate them. They assumed continuity. Technology delivered discontinuity. This mismatch created dramatic forecast errors. Some models predicted population decline that never materialized. Others missed declines that arrived quickly. In both cases, the assumption was the same, that tomorrow would resemble today. The irony is that forecasters knew this assumption was weak. They often discussed it in technical sections. They warned about uncertainty, but those warnings rarely traveled. They stayed buried. What reached the public was the conclusion, not the condition. The assumption also influenced how panic developed. If decline is assumed to continue, panic feels justified. If change is possible, panic feels premature. The assumption removed possibility. It locked the future into a single path. This was never mathematically necessary. It was narratively convenient. Forecasts that included multiple scenarios existed. They showed a range of futures, but ranges are harder to communicate. They feel indecisive. Decisiveness is valued, even when it is false. The assumption simplified communication at the cost of accuracy. It made forecasts easier to understand, and easier to fear. Over time, the repeated failure of forecasts eroded trust. People noticed that predictions kept changing, and that certainty faded. This led to cynicism, which is not helpful either. The goal of forecasting is not to predict perfectly. It is to explore possibilities. The assumption of trend continuity turned exploration into declaration. This was a mistake. The breaking of forecasts was not a failure of mathematics. It was a failure of humility. The assumption assumed too much. About people, about stability, about the future. The lesson was not that forecasting is useless. It was that assumptions matter, especially quiet ones. The most dangerous assumptions are the ones everyone forgets are there. They sit quietly in the background. shaping conclusions, justifying panic, while pretending to be neutral. The assumption that broke most population forecasts was never malicious. It was convenient. And convenience in modelling often comes at a cost. That cost was accuracy and calm. Once the assumption was questioned, the forecasts softened. They became less dramatic, less certain, more honest, which made them less popular, but more useful. The math did not demand certainty. It allowed uncertainty. Humans filled in the rest, and in doing so broke forecasts that might otherwise have remained modest tools. Instead of becoming fuel for panic, the assumption was small, but its impact was enormous. Because once you assume the future is fixed, you stop listening to the present, and the present, inconveniently, keeps changing, whether the model is ready or not. Aging populations and the fear of empty futures arrived quietly. There was no announcement. No single report that said, "From now on we worry about age." It just became noticeable one day. Someone looked at a chart and realized that one color was getting wider, older, calmer, slower. At first, this did not feel threatening. People live longer. That sounds good. It is good. But math has a way of making good news feel complicated. As life expectancy increased, the shape of the population changed. Not suddenly, gradually, like furniture being rearranged while no one is watching. More people at the top, fewer at the bottom. The pyramid became a column, then something flatter. This visual made people uneasy, not because it meant suffering, but because it meant unfamiliarity. Societies are built on rhythm. Children arrive, they grow, they work, they age. When the rhythm slows, people notice. The fear was not really about older people. It was about imbalance. More retirees, fewer workers, more memory, less replacement. These words began to appear. Replacement again. The math quietly connected age with time. It showed that decisions made decades earlier were now visible, which meant decisions made now would echo forward. This realization made people nervous. It removed the illusion that problems could be fixed quickly. Aging populations move slowly. They do not respond to urgent language. They respond to decades. This was uncomfortable for systems designed around speed. Budgets run yearly. Elections run in cycles. Aging runs continuously. The mismatch created anxiety. The fear of empty futures emerged from this mismatch. Not empty, as in abandoned. Empty, as in quiet. The image was not collapse. It was stillness. Empty classrooms. Closed playgrounds. These images were powerful. They were also selective. They ignored busy hospitals, active communities of older adults. But emptiness is more emotionally striking than fullness. The math itself did not predict emptiness. It predicted change. But change without familiar markers feels like loss. Aging populations challenged assumptions. Assumptions about productivity, about contribution, about value. These are not mathematical questions, but math put them on the table. By counting age, math forced society to confront time, and time makes people uncomfortable. The idea of an aging society suggested permanence. Once people age, they do not unage. This made the trend feel irreversible, more so than birth rates. Birth rates can change. Age structures take much longer. This added weight to the panic. The fear was not just that there were fewer children, it was that the future felt pre-written, decades in advance. The math reinforced this feeling. Population projections showed waves moving upward, age cohorts advancing year by year, like a slow procession. This visualization was haunting, not dramatic, just steady. The calmness of it made it feel inevitable. Aging also intersected with economic fears. Who pays for what? Who supports whom? These questions are ancient, but numbers made them feel immediate. Ratios appeared. Workers to retirees, dependents to contributors. These ratios became talking points. They were simple, and therefore dangerous. Ratios simplify relationships. They reduce people to categories. This made discussions colder, more abstract. People were spoken about as burdens or supports. The math did not ask for this framing, but it enabled it. The fear of empty futures was also a fear of loneliness. A society with fewer young people was imagined as less vibrant, less creative, less hopeful. These associations are cultural, not mathematical, but math gave them structure. By showing fewer births, it suggested fewer beginnings. This symbolism mattered. Births are not just numbers. They represent renewal, so fewer births felt like a lack of renewal, even if life continued, even if communities adapted. The math did not say renewal was impossible, but the imagery suggested it was fading. This is where emotion overtook analysis. The fear was not rational. It was symbolic. Aging populations also highlighted inequality. Some regions aged faster than others. Some communities shrank. Others grew. The math revealed these differences, which raised uncomfortable questions. Why here and not there? Why them and not us? These questions often lacked good answers, which made them unsettling. The fear of empty futures was strongest in places already experiencing decline, rural areas, post-industrial regions. The math did not cause these declines, but it named them. Naming something makes it harder to ignore. This is both useful and painful. Aging also forced a confrontation with care. Who cares for whom? How? With what resources? These questions are deeply personal. Math turned them into policy problems, which felt invasive. People do not like their futures reduced to ratios. The idea of an aging society also challenged progress narratives. Modernity is often associated with growth, expansion, more. Aging suggested plateau, stability, or even contraction. These ideas feel like stagnation in cultures that worship progress. The math did not judge. It described, but descriptions can feel like judgments when they clash with identity. The fear was not that aging is bad. It was that aging did not fit the story people wanted to tell about the future. This mismatch created discomfort, which became panic. The calmness of demographic change made the fear worse. There was no dramatic moment to react to, no turning point, just a slow realization. Each year, slightly older. Each year, slightly fewer children. This slowness was unsettling. It denied urgency while demanding attention. Aging populations also exposed time horizons. Young societies think short-term. Older societies are forced to think long-term. This shift in perspective was not always welcome. Long-term thinking requires patience and humility, two qualities panic lacks. The fear of empty futures was not about math predicting absence. It was about math revealing time. Time passing, time accumulating, time refusing to stop. This is uncomfortable, especially for institutions designed to act quickly. The numbers did not say the future would be empty. They said it would be different. Different age distributions, different needs, different rhythms. This difference was interpreted as loss, because difference often is, but difference is not disappearance. The panic blurred this distinction. The fear imagined empty streets, silent schools, but reality offered something else. Communities adapting, roles shifting, new forms of connection. These were harder to quantify, so they were often ignored. The math was blamed for pessimism it did not express. It merely counted, and counting age makes time visible, which is the real source of discomfort. Aging populations forced societies to confront their own temporality, their finiteness, their cycles. This is not a math problem. It is a human one. Math just happened to hold up the mirror, quietly, without commentary. The fear of empty futures grew in that reflection, not because the mirror was cruel, but because it was honest, and honesty, when it comes to time, is rarely comforting. The future was not empty. It was aging, and aging, unlike collapse, does not announce itself. It just arrives, 1 year at a time, measured calmly, by numbers that do not care how that makes anyone feel. The mathematicians who warned everyone were not dramatic people. They did not shout. They did not predict doom. They mostly hesitated. which, unfortunately, made them easy to ignore. These were not the kind of warnings that make headlines. They were careful, qualified, full of phrases like "it depends" and "within a range," not exactly panic-friendly language. Most of them did not even call what they were seeing a crisis. They called it a pattern, or a possibility, or a scenario among many. This was not satisfying. People wanted clarity. They wanted answers. The mathematicians offered uncertainty, which is mathematically honest, and politically inconvenient. Many of these warnings appeared in footnotes, in appendices, in technical sections that no one read. They explained assumptions. They explained limitations. They explained why long-term forecasts should be treated cautiously. And then the headlines ignored all of that. The warnings did not say this will happen. They said, if these conditions persist. That distinction mattered. It was rarely preserved. Some mathematicians pointed out that birth rates had always fluctuated, that declines had happened before, that rebounds were possible. They referenced history. They cited examples. They sounded calm, too calm. Calm voices are often drowned out by confident ones, especially when fear is involved. Others warned about overinterpreting short-term trends. They showed how sensitive projections were to small changes, how tiny adjustments early could lead to vastly different outcomes later. They tried to explain this gently, with examples, with analogies, but the message did not land, because it required patience, and patience was in short supply. Some mathematicians cautioned against treating replacement level as a hard boundary. They explained that it was a descriptive concept, not a rule. They emphasized migration, adaptation, social change. These explanations complicated the story. Complication is rarely welcome, especially when decisions feel urgent. There were also warnings about feedback loops, that people respond to narratives. That panic itself can influence behavior. That telling everyone the future looks bleak might make it so. These warnings were deeply uncomfortable. They suggested responsibility, not just observation. They implied that the way numbers were discussed mattered. This was not a popular idea. It was easier to blame the numbers. Some mathematicians explicitly warned against linear extrapolation. They showed examples of past projections that failed. They tried to teach humility. They were not trying to stop planning. They were trying to stop overconfidence. But humility does not command attention. Confidence does, especially confident fear. A few even warned that focusing too much on birth rates could distract from more important questions, like quality of life, like inequality, like sustainability. They suggested that fewer people could coexist with better systems. This idea was quietly radical. It challenged the assumption that more was always better. It did not spread widely, because it did not align with existing anxieties. Many of these mathematicians were not public figures. They did not appear on television. They did not simplify their message for sound bites. They wrote papers. They spoke at conferences. They assumed readers would read. This was optimistic. The warnings existed. They were just buried under louder interpretations. Some mathematicians were uncomfortable with how their work was used. They saw their cautious projections turned into dramatic claims. They saw uncertainty erased. They felt misunderstood. But correcting public narratives is difficult, especially once those narratives take on a life of their own. Attempts to clarify often sound like backtracking or denial, which further undermines trust. This created a strange situation. The same experts whose work fueled panic were also the ones trying to calm it. But only one of those messages travelled. The panic was easier to understand. It required no nuance, just a glance at a graph. The warnings required listening, and listening takes time. There was also an internal tension. Some mathematicians feared being seen as minimizing a real issue. They worried that emphasizing uncertainty would be interpreted as complacency, so they chose their words carefully. Perhaps too carefully. They hedged, they qualified, they softened. In a media environment that rewards boldness, this was a disadvantage. Others warned about the moral weight being placed on individuals. They cautioned against framing birth rates as a personal responsibility. They noted that such framing could backfire. They were right, but their warnings were subtle. They did not accuse, they suggested. Suggestion does not trend. Some mathematicians tried to reframe the conversation. They talked about systems rather than numbers, about housing, about education, about stability. They argued that birth rates were outcomes, not inputs. This perspective required a shift from control to context. It did not gain much traction because it did not offer a quick fix. The warnings were also fragmented. Different experts emphasized different risks. Some focused on aging, others on migration, others on inequality. There was no single unified message. Panic, by contrast, was unified. Numbers are going down. That was enough. The mathematicians were also constrained by their discipline. They could describe what the models did. They could explain limitations, but they could not dictate policy, nor did they want to. Their role was to inform, not to decide. This restraint was misinterpreted as weakness, as uncertainty, as lack of conviction, which it was. But conviction is not accuracy. The warnings often came with context, historical context, comparative context. They tried to show that demographic change was not new, that societies had adapted before, that panic was not inevitable. But history moves slowly. Panic moves fast. Some warnings focused on time horizons. They explained that demographic changes unfold over decades, that short-term reactions could cause long-term harm. This message was not popular. It conflicted with political cycles, with urgency, with the need to be seen doing something. A warning that says slow down rarely wins. The mathematicians who warned everyone did not fail. They did their job. They presented evidence. They explained uncertainty. They cautioned against overreach. The failure was collective, in how information was filtered, simplified, amplified. The warnings were there. They just did not fit the story people wanted to tell. That story needed clarity. It needed urgency. It needed heroes and villains. The mathematicians offered ranges, probabilities, scenarios. These do not make good characters. Some mathematicians later expressed frustration, not at being ignored, but at being misrepresented. Their careful language had been stripped away, leaving behind conclusions they did not fully endorse. This is a common fate for nuance. It does not survive compression, especially when compressed into fear. The warnings were never about saying everything is fine. They were about saying we don't know everything. This distinction was lost, and so the panic grew louder. While the warnings remained quiet, the mathematicians did not stop warning. They continued publishing, refining models, updating assumptions. They did not retreat. They just stayed out of the spotlight, because the spotlight was not interested in hesitation. It was interested in certainty, even false certainty. In the end, the warnings mattered. They influenced better models, more cautious interpretations. Over time, they softened the conversation, but this took years. By then, the panic had already shaped policy, shaped perception, shaped headlines. The mathematicians who warned everyone were not ignored because they were wrong. They were ignored because they were careful, and care does not compete well with fear, especially when fear is dressed up as math. The irony is that the warnings were the most mathematically honest part of the story. They acknowledged limits. They respected complexity. They refused to oversimplify human life, which is exactly what math, at its best, is supposed to do. But best practices rarely go viral. They just quietly persist, waiting for the moment when people are ready to listen again, after the noise has faded, and the panic has tired itself out, which it always does. Eventually, when panic turned into headlines, the math officially lost control of the conversation. This was not because the numbers changed. They didn't. It was because the language did. Headlines are allergic to hesitation. They do not like maybe. They do not like it depends. They like verbs, strong ones. Words like collapse, crisis, and plunge began appearing more frequently, not because the situation suddenly worsened, but because attention needed fuel. Math does not provide fuel, fear does. The same data that had been discussed calmly in reports now appeared in articles with very different tones. A slight decline became a warning sign. A small fluctuation became a trend. Context quietly disappeared. This was not malicious. It was structural. Headlines are designed to be noticed. They are not designed to be accurate summaries of complex processes. Once birth rates entered the headline economy, nuance became optional. Graphs were cropped, timescales shortened, axes adjusted. Nothing technically false, but deeply misleading. A 10-year trend shown without the preceding 20 years tells a very different story. This visual shorthand did most of the work. People rarely read beyond the headline. They absorbed the mood, and the mood was anxious. Panic thrives in short formats. It fits neatly into a sentence. Birth rates hit new low. That sentence feels definitive. It suggests finality. It does not invite questions. No one asks, compared to when, or how significant is the change? The headline already decided how you should feel. This changed how birth rates were talked about socially. They stopped being a background statistic. They became a topic, something people discussed casually, at dinner, at work, often with vague concern. Did you see that article? Concern spread faster than understanding. The media also favoured extremes. Regions with the sharpest declines received the most coverage. Regions with stability were ignored. This created a distorted picture. It felt like everything was falling everywhere, which was not true. But truth is not evenly distributed in headlines. The global framing amplified this effect. A decline in one country was presented as evidence of a worldwide problem. Local causes were lost. Everything was connected. This made the issue feel larger and less solvable. Headlines also introduced urgency. Words like now, soon, and imminent appeared. Demographic change does not operate on those timescales, but urgency is persuasive. It demands attention. It pressures decision makers. Once urgency enters, patience exits. The math had been patient. The headlines were not. Another shift was personalization. Articles began asking what declining birth rates meant for you. This framing made the issue intimate and alarming. It implied direct consequences, often without explanation. Your pension, your job, your future. These connections were not wrong, but they were simplified. Simplification in service of fear. The media also favoured narratives of blame. Someone had to be responsible. Was it lifestyle choices? Cultural shifts? Economic pressures? Each explanation was presented confidently, rarely with evidence. The math was not consulted. It was referenced. There is a difference. Being referenced gives authority. Being consulted requires care. Once panic became part of the narrative, it fed itself. Articles cited other articles. Reports cited headlines. The line between analysis and commentary blurred. This created an echo. The same concerns repeated. The same phrases reused. Familiarity bred acceptance. Eventually, the idea that falling birth rates were a crisis felt obvious, not because it had been proven, but because it had been repeated. This repetition created a feedback loop. Policymakers reacted to headlines. Headlines reacted to policy announcements. Each reinforced the other. The math sat quietly in the background, still counting, still updating, still cautious. The emotional temperature rose anyway. Another effect of headlines was compression. Long-term trends were squeezed into short narratives. Decades collapsed into paragraphs. This made gradual change feel sudden. Sudden change demands reaction. Gradual change invites reflection. Reflection does not generate clicks. The media also struggled with uncertainty. Uncertainty does not headline well. Experts disagree is not compelling, so disagreement was minimized. A dominant narrative emerged. Birth rates are falling. This is bad. Something must be done. The math never said this so simply, but simplicity won. Some journalists tried to add nuance. They included caveats, quotes from experts. These were often buried after the first paragraph. Few readers reached them. The headline had already done its work. This created a disconnect between experts and the public. Experts felt misrepresented. The public felt informed. Both were dissatisfied. The panic also changed the tone of political debate. Birth rates became talking points, used to justify unrelated agendas, immigration policy, social norms, economic reforms. The numbers were invoked as evidence, often selectively. This politicization made calm discussion harder. Once an issue becomes symbolic, it resists correction. Facts become secondary to meaning. The math did not ask to be politicized, but it was convenient. It provided numbers. Numbers sound objective. They can be used to support many arguments. This flexibility made them attractive and dangerous. The headlines also created generational tension. Articles framed older generations as burdens, younger generations as insufficient. This framing was divisive and unnecessary. The math did not suggest conflict. It described proportions. Conflict was added later. The phrase demographic time bomb appeared. This phrase is emotionally powerful. It suggests sudden disaster. Demographics do not explode. They evolve. But explosions sell. Evolution does not. The language of headlines shaped expectations. People began expecting catastrophe. When catastrophe did not arrive, trust eroded. This is another unintended effect. Overstating risk can backfire. It creates fatigue. People stop listening. The media rarely revisits predictions that did not come true. They move on, but the residue remains. The sense that something is wrong, that something is slipping, even when daily life looks unchanged. This lingering unease is hard to measure, but it affects behavior. People delay decisions. They hesitate. They feel uncertain, which can reinforce the very trends being discussed. This irony is rarely acknowledged. The headlines also flattened time. Everything felt immediate. This discouraged long-term thinking. Policies were judged by short-term reactions, not long-term outcomes. The math could not operate at this pace. It measures slowly. It updates annually. It does not rush. The mismatch between media tempo and demographic tempo created confusion. Expectations rose. Results lagged. Frustration followed. When panic turned into headlines, the conversation shifted irreversibly. Birth rates were no longer just numbers. They were symbols of decline, of anxiety, of uncertainty about the future. The math was still there, still offering careful descriptions, but it was no longer driving the narrative. The narrative had taken on a life of its own, powered by urgency, fueled by repetition, amplified by fear. This does not mean the concern was invented. It means it was exaggerated, distorted, simplified. The math did not shout. The headlines did. And once shouting begins, listening becomes difficult, especially to quiet voices, especially to careful explanations, especially to math that refuses to be dramatic. The panic did not need to be manufactured. It just needed to be framed, and framing, once established, is very hard to undo, even when the numbers themselves remain calm, unimpressed, still counting, still waiting for someone to look past the headline. And notice what the data is actually saying, instead of what it is being used to imply. Why population collapse is a terrible phrase has very little to do with math, and almost everything to do with imagination. Collapse is a loud word. It suggests suddenness, violence, a clear before and after. Buildings fall, systems fail, everything stops. Population does not do this. It never has. Even in the most extreme cases, population change is slow, uneven, and deeply boring, which is exactly why collapse is such a misleading choice. The phrase entered the conversation quietly, then stuck. It felt useful. It captured attention. It made complex change feel dramatic. And drama travels. But population collapse describes something that the numbers themselves do not show. It compresses decades into a moment. It turns drift into disaster. This compression is emotionally effective and mathematically dishonest. The math does not show populations collapsing. It shows them aging, reshaping, redistributing. These are not exciting verbs. They do not provoke urgency. They do not fit well into headlines, so they were replaced. Collapse sounds like failure. It implies that something was strong and is now weak, that something went wrong. This moral framing is not neutral. It assigns blame, even when no one did anything wrong. The phrase also implies irreversibility. Once something collapses, it does not come back. This idea haunted discussions. If birth rates fall, and that means collapse, then urgency feels justified. But population trends are not irreversible in that way. They respond to conditions, they bend, they stall, sometimes they reverse. Collapse removes this flexibility from the conversation. It locks the future into a single story. The math never did that. Language did. Population collapse also creates a sense of helplessness. If collapse is coming, what can individuals do? Nothing meaningful. This framing discourages thoughtful action. It replaces curiosity with resignation, which is not productive. The phrase also confuses scale. Collapse sounds total, as if everything everywhere is affected equally. In reality, demographic change is uneven. Some regions shrink, others grow, some age rapidly, others remain young. Collapse ignores this variation. It paints the entire picture with a single brush. This simplifies communication. It also distorts reality. The phrase became popular because it answered a need to explain discomfort, a need to justify anxiety, a need to make slow change feel urgent. But urgency is not always appropriate. Population change is not an emergency. It is a condition. Conditions require adaptation, not panic. The language of collapse also shifts attention away from solutions. If collapse is inevitable, why bother discussing nuance? Why talk about policy design? Why talk about systems? Collapse suggests there is nothing to manage, only something to mourn. This framing was emotionally powerful and practically useless. The math does not mourn. It measures. It shows transitions. Transitions can be challenging, but they are not endings. The phrase population collapse also carries historical baggage. It echoes stories of fallen civilizations, abandoned cities, lost empires. These stories are compelling. They are also rarely about birth rates. They involve war, disease, environmental collapse, political failure. Reducing them to fertility numbers is misleading, but the imagery sticks. People imagine ruins, silence, empty streets. The math shows none of this. It shows slower growth, different age distributions, different pressures. The phrase invites people to imagine a future that is emptier, quieter, less alive. This imagery is powerful and inaccurate. A society with fewer children is not lifeless. It is different. Different does not mean dead. The language of collapse also affects how people see themselves. If you live in a society described as collapsing, how does that shape your choices? It creates uncertainty. It discourages long-term commitment. Why invest in a future that is described as failing? This framing can become self-reinforcing, not because the math demands it, but because the story does. Words shape behavior. This is not controversial. Marketing knows this. Politics knows this. Demographics often forget it. The phrase also discourages generational understanding. Older generations may feel blamed. Younger generations may feel accused. Neither reaction is helpful. The math does not assign guilt. Language often does. Population collapse suggests someone caused it. This invites conflict, rather than collaboration. Another issue is that collapse suggests a single moment, a tipping point, a point of no return. Demographics do not work like this. There are no cliffs, no sudden drops, just slopes, sometimes shallow, sometimes steep, but always continuous. The phrase hides continuity, which makes adaptation harder, because adaptation works best when change is gradual, and recognized as such. The math is very good at showing gradual change. Language replaced it with catastrophe. This replacement was not necessary. It was a choice, and choices have consequences. The phrase also creates fatigue. If collapse is always coming, people eventually stop listening. Urgency loses its power. This happened. Warnings escalated, then stalled, then escalated again. The audience grew tired. The math did not change. The language did. Overuse of dramatic framing dulls attention. It makes it harder to respond when something truly urgent arises. This is one of the hidden costs of exaggeration. Another problem is that collapse implies uniform suffering, but demographic change creates trade-offs. Some challenges increase, others decrease. Different groups experience change differently. Collapse flattens these experiences. It erases winners and losers. It treats everyone as equally doomed, which is rarely true. The math shows redistribution, not disappearance. Population moves. It concentrates. It spreads. It shifts. Collapse implies vanishing. This is not what the numbers show. The phrase also distracts from more useful questions. How do societies adapt to aging? How do systems change with fewer children? How do we design institutions for different population shapes? These questions are constructive. Collapse shuts them down. It frames change as failure rather than transformation. The math never suggested failure. It described change. Language decided how that change would be interpreted. Some analysts tried to replace the phrase. They suggested alternatives: population transition, demographic shift. These phrases were accurate. They were also boring. Boring does not travel, especially when fear is available. So collapse won, and with it came a narrative of loss. Loss of vitality, loss of future, loss of meaning, none of which were conclusions drawn from the data. They were emotional overlays. The math was blamed for pessimism. It did not express. It simply counted. And counting revealed something unfamiliar. Unfamiliarity was interpreted as danger. The phrase also limits imagination. If collapse is the story, there is no room for creative responses, no room for redesign, no room for new ways of organizing life. Collapse is an ending, but demographics do not end. They continue, in different forms. The terrible thing about population collapse is not that it is inaccurate. It is that it narrows thought. It replaces curiosity with fear. It simplifies complexity into dread. The math did not ask for this simplification. It offered detail, variation, gradual change. Language took that and turned it into catastrophe. This does not mean concern is unwarranted. Change brings challenges, but challenges require clarity, not exaggeration. Population collapse feels urgent. It feels important. It feels like something must be done, but it also feels final, and finality discourages patience. Patience is essential for demographic thinking, because demographic change is slow, slower than panic, slower than headlines, slower than political cycles. The phrase creates a mismatch between tempo and reality, which fuels frustration. The math remains calm. It continues counting, showing change without commentary, waiting for language to catch up, to describe what is happening without importing fear, without borrowing metaphors from disasters that do not apply. Why population collapse is a terrible phrase is not because populations never change. They do. It is terrible because it tells the wrong story. A story of endings. Instead of transitions, a story of failure. Instead of adaptation, a story that demands panic. Instead of understanding, the math never said collapse. It said change. We chose the rest. And choices, unlike trends, can be revised, if we let them, quietly, without shouting, without pretending that slow change needs explosive language. Sometimes the most responsible thing to do is retire a dramatic phrase, and let the numbers speak in their own, very boring way, which is often where the truth lives. Calm, unimpressed, and very much uninterested in collapse. The quiet reality behind the panic is not dramatic, which is why it took so long to notice. After all the graphs, the headlines, the projections, and the language of collapse, the actual numbers were still doing something very boring. They were changing slowly. No sudden drops, no disappearances, just gradual shifts. This is the part that rarely makes it into conversation, because panic expects action, and slow change feels like inaction. The quiet reality is that populations do not vanish. They reorganize, they redistribute, they age, they adapt. None of this happens on the timescale panic prefers. The math has been saying this the entire time, but it says it without emphasis, without urgency, without a sense of crisis. which makes it easy to overlook. Behind the panic, most demographic change looks like inconvenience rather than disaster. More pressure here, less pressure there, systems that need adjustment, not systems that are breaking. The numbers show stress points: healthcare, caregiving, workforce transitions. These are challenges, but they are not endings. The quiet reality is that decline is rarely uniform. Some regions lose people, others gain. Cities grow while rural areas shrink, or the reverse. The average hides this movement. But movement is the real story. Population does not just shrink, it flows. The panic treats population as a single object. The math treats it as a distribution. That difference matters. The quiet reality also includes migration. People move. They always have. Borders shift. Policies change. Opportunities appear. Migration complicates simple narratives of decline. It does not eliminate challenges, but it changes their shape. The panic often treats migration as an afterthought. The math does not. The quiet reality is that birth rates do not act alone. They interact with mortality, with longevity, with movement. Focusing on one number exaggerates its importance. The math never said birth rates were the only variable. We did. The numbers also show resilience. Communities adjust. Families adapt. New norms emerge. Smaller households do not mean weaker ones. Different family structures do not mean less care. The panic often equates difference with deficiency. The math does not make that judgment. The quiet reality is that many societies already live below replacement level, and have done so for decades. They did not collapse. They changed. They adjusted policies. They redesigned institutions. Not perfectly, not without difficulty. But they continued. This reality is inconvenient for panic. It suggests that the future may be manageable. Manageable is not exciting. It does not demand immediate reaction. It invites planning. Planning is slower than fear. The quiet reality also includes uncertainty, not as a threat, but as a constant. The future is not fixed. Demographic trends are sensitive to conditions. Conditions change. This does not mean everything will improve. It means nothing is guaranteed. Panic often assumes the worst path is the only path. The math never does. The quiet reality is that projections are tools, not predictions. They explore scenarios. They do not declare destinies. This distinction was lost. Once recovered, much of the panic loses its foundation. The numbers also show trade-offs. Fewer children can mean more resources per child. Longer lives can mean more experience. Slower growth can ease environmental pressure. None of these are automatic benefits, but they are possibilities. The panic frames all change as loss. The math allows for gain. The quiet reality is that demographic change forces choices. How do we organize work? How do we structure care? How do we distribute resources? These are political and social questions. Math highlights them. It does not answer them. The panic often pretends math has answers. It does not. It offers constraints. Within those constraints, societies choose. The quiet reality is that many fears are projections, not from the data, but from uncertainty. Uncertainty makes people anxious. Math makes uncertainty visible. That visibility can feel like a threat, but it is not one. It is information. The panic interpreted information as warning. The quiet reality is that some things will be harder. Supporting aging populations requires effort. Adjusting labour markets takes time. Redesigning institutions is uncomfortable. None of this is trivial, but none of it is unprecedented. History is full of adaptation. The math does not erase that history. It fits inside it. The quiet reality is that dramatic language created expectations that the data never promised. People expected sudden consequences. When those did not appear, confusion followed. Was the panic wrong? Not exactly. Was it exaggerated? Often. The math did not change, interpretation did. The quiet reality also includes scale. Global population change unfolds over centuries, not news cycles. This scale mismatch created much of the anxiety. People were asked to feel urgency about something that moves slowly. That tension is exhausting. It leads to burnout, disengagement. The quiet reality is that most people experience demographic change indirectly, through policy adjustments, through social shifts, not through dramatic daily disruption. This makes panic feel abstract, which weakens its credibility. The math reflects this abstraction. It shows trends, not moments. The quiet reality is that fear often fills gaps in understanding. When numbers are complex, people rely on stories. Stories simplify, sometimes too much. The math never told a story of collapse. It told a story of transition. The panic rewrote it. The quiet reality also includes limits. Math cannot tell us what kind of society we want. It cannot define success. It cannot measure meaning. It can show patterns, trends, constraints. What we do with that is not mathematical. It is human. The panic often pretended math demanded certain choices. It did not. It described consequences. Choices remained open. The quiet reality is that demographic change is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be managed. This framing matters. Problems invite fixes. Conditions require care. Care is slower, less dramatic, more sustainable. The math supports care. Panic demands fixes. Fixes often fail. The quiet reality is that many demographic fears are rooted in identity. Fear of decline is fear of loss of status. Fear of being fewer is fear of being forgotten. Math does not address identity. It reveals numbers. The interpretation adds emotion. Understanding this helps separate data from dread. The quiet reality is that behind the panic, life continues. People are born. People age. People adapt. The graphs update. Nothing collapses. Nothing explodes. Change accumulates. Slowly. The math never stopped being calm. It never escalated. It never declared crisis. It counted. It compared. It waited. The panic filled the silence. The quiet reality is that silence was never a warning. It was an invitation to think, to plan, to adjust expectations, to accept that the future does not arrive as a verdict. It arrives as a process, measured 1 year at a time. The numbers do not shout. They whisper. And when you listen closely, what they say is not terrifying. It is mundane, complex, manageable, incomplete. The quiet reality behind the panic is that most of the fear came from interpretation, not from the data. The data never promised disaster. It never guaranteed safety. It offered information. What happened next was human, and that is where the story always was. Not in the numbers, but in how we chose to hear them, quietly or loudly, with patience or panic. The math did not choose for us. It never does. It simply waits for someone to stop shouting and notice that the future, while uncertain, is not empty, just different. And difference, unlike collapse, leaves room to breathe. The future that refuses to be predicted has been quietly mocking forecasts for as long as forecasts have existed. Every generation believes it stands at a turning point. Every generation is convinced that this time is different. And every generation is eventually surprised. This is not because people are foolish. It is because the future is deeply uncooperative. Math likes patterns. History enjoys interruptions. Population forecasts sit awkwardly between the two. They try to describe human behavior using continuity. Humans respond with novelty. The future has a habit of arriving sideways, not in the direction anyone expected. The forecasts imagined smooth paths. Reality introduced detours, unexpected ones. Technological shifts changed work. Cultural shifts changed priorities. Medical advances extended lives. None of these were fully predicted. All of them mattered. The future refused to follow the script. This does not mean forecasting is pointless. It means forecasting is provisional. Every projection is a conditional statement. If this, then that. The problem is that people tend to forget the if. They remember the say. That The future takes advantage of this forgetfulness. It thrives in the space between expectation and outcome. One of the most consistent patterns in demographic forecasting is embarrassment. Projections from the past look absurd in hindsight. They overestimated growth. They underestimated adaptation. They missed turning points. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of imagination. The future invents options no one planned for. Who predicted remote work reshaping family planning? Who anticipated social norms shifting as quickly as they did? Who expected global events to reorder priorities overnight? The math did not miss these things. They were not available to be missed. You cannot model what does not yet exist. This is why the future resists prediction. It introduces new variables mid-calculation. Without warning, the future also responds to being predicted. This is an uncomfortable truth. Forecasts influence behavior. Behavior alters outcomes. This feedback loop breaks linear prediction. If people believe something is coming, they prepare. Preparation changes the result. The future notices this and adjusts. This is not mysticism. It is sociology. Birth rates are especially sensitive to expectation. If people believe the future is unstable, they hesitate. If they believe it is manageable, they commit. Forecasts shape belief. Belief shapes decisions. Decisions shape data. The future slips away. This makes demographic prediction uniquely fragile. It deals with choices, not constants. The future also refuses to be consistent. Trends stall, reverse, plateau, then resume. This drives forecasters mad. Models prefer monotonic behavior. Human life prefers variety. The future does not explain itself. It just happens. Another reason the future resists prediction is scale. Small changes matter. Tiny shifts in behavior can compound. A slight delay in average age at first birth can alter decades of projections. These small shifts are hard to anticipate. They emerge quietly, without announcement. The future specializes in quiet emergence. The math often notices too late, then recalibrates, then waits again. The future also delights in context. The same policy produces different results at different times. What worked once may fail later. Not because the policy changed, but because the environment did. The future does not repeat itself reliably. It rhymes occasionally. Forecasts mistake rhyme for repetition. This mistake is understandable and persistent. The future also punishes certainty. The more confident a prediction, the more likely it is to be wrong. This is not a law, it is an observation. Overconfidence ignores unknowns. The future is mostly unknowns. The future that refuses to be predicted is not hostile. It is indifferent. It does not care about models. It does not care about panic. It does not care about graphs. It unfolds. This indifference is frustrating. It denies closure. It denies control. But it also denies catastrophe. Because catastrophes require precision. The future is messy. Messiness dampens extremes. The future also inherits past adaptations. Societies are not blank slates. They carry memory. Institutions evolve. Norms shift. These inherited adaptations make sudden collapse unlikely. They also make precise prediction difficult. The future borrows. It recombines. It improvises. Forecasts struggle with improvisation. The future also contains people who have not yet made decisions. Those decisions will matter. They will surprise. They always do. The future is shaped by individuals responding to circumstances that models cannot foresee. Models average. Individuals deviate. Enough deviation breaks prediction. This is why population forecasts come with ranges, scenarios, probabilities. The future laughs at point estimates. It prefers clouds. The refusal to be predicted is not a flaw. It is a feature. It protects societies from rigidity. If the future were predictable, adaptation would stop. People would optimize too early, locking in suboptimal choices. Uncertainty preserves flexibility. Flexibility is survival. The panic surrounding birth rates often treated uncertainty as a threat. It is not. It is a buffer. The future that refuses to be predicted leaves room for correction, for learning, for change. This is not comforting to planners. It is comforting to humans, because it means no trend is destiny, no forecast is final, no graph gets the last word. The future has embarrassed experts before. It will do so again. This is not an insult. It is a reminder. Humility belongs in forecasting, not certainty. The future also resists prediction because it is influenced by values. Values change. What people prioritize shifts, sometimes rapidly, sometimes unexpectedly. Birth rates respond to values. Values are not stable variables. They are social constructs. They evolve. The future evolves with them. The math can observe value shifts after they occur. It cannot schedule them. The future also resists prediction because it includes events that redefine baselines. Wars, crises, breakthroughs. These events do not follow demographic timetables. They interrupt. They reset expectations. Forecasts do not like resets. The future specializes in them. This does not mean forecasting is useless. It means it must be modest. It must accept that its role is to explore, not declare. The future does not sign contracts. It does not honor projections. It offers possibilities, some frightening, some hopeful, most mixed. The future that refuses to be predicted is not empty. It is open. Open futures are uncomfortable. They lack narrative closure. They do not promise outcomes. They require participation. The panic tried to close the future, to name it, to label it, decline. The future refused. It remained plural, messy, uncertain, which is where human agency lives. The refusal to be predicted is what allows societies to adapt, to change course, to learn. It is what makes history interesting and survivable. The math acknowledges this quietly, in error bars, in footnotes, in cautious language. It never claimed certainty. We projected certainty onto it. The future ignored that projection, as it always does. The future that refuses to be predicted is not mocking us. It is protecting us from our own overconfidence, from mistaking trends for fate, from mistaking numbers for destiny. The calm truth is this: no demographic graph has ever captured the future in full. No projection has ever owned tomorrow. The future remains stubbornly unfinished, which is exactly what makes it possible. The numbers will update, the models will revise, the forecasts will adjust, and the future will continue doing what it does best, arriving, 1 year at a time, unannounced, unpredictable, and entirely uninterested in what we thought it was supposed to do, which, in the end, is the most human outcome imaginable. What the math is actually good for is far less dramatic than what it was asked to do. Math was never meant to predict the future perfectly. It was never meant to calm anxiety. And it was definitely never meant to decide how many children anyone should have. Math is a tool, not a judge, not a prophet. Its strength is not certainty. It is structure. The math behind population trends is very good at one thing: showing relationships. It shows how birth rates interact with age, how age interacts with time, how time interacts with systems. It does not tell you what will happen. It tells you what would happen if certain conditions stayed the same. That if is doing all the work. Math is good at bounding reality, at saying, within these assumptions, here is a range of outcomes. Ranges are honest. They acknowledge uncertainty. They leave room for surprise. The panic wanted point estimates, clear answers. Math resisted. This resistance was misinterpreted as weakness. In reality, it was integrity. What math is actually good for is slowing conversations down. It forces definitions. What do you mean by decline? Over what time period? Compared to what baseline? These questions are annoying. They are also essential. Without them, discussion drifts into feeling. Math pulls it back, gently. Math is also good at revealing hidden assumptions. When a model produces an alarming result, the first useful question is not what should we do? It is what did we assume? Assumptions are where meaning hides. Math makes them visible. If people are assumed to behave a certain way, math will show the consequences. If that behavior changes, the outcome changes. This is not a flaw. It is a feature. Math does not say assumptions are true. It shows what follows from them. What math is actually good for is comparison, not ranking. Comparison with context. Comparing scenarios. Comparing histories. Comparing outcomes under different conditions. This helps identify leverage points, places where small changes matter, and places where they do not. The panic treated all change as urgent. Math distinguishes. It shows that some shifts matter more than others, that some fears are disproportionate, that some worries are premature. Math is also good at humility. It keeps track of error, uncertainty, variance. These are not weaknesses, they are acknowledgements. Math does not hide its ignorance, it labels it. Confidence without uncertainty is not math, it is storytelling. What math is actually good for is preventing overreaction, when used properly. It shows inertia, how slow large systems move. This discourages panic, because panic assumes speed. Math often reveals slowness. Slowness gives time, time gives options. Math is also good at showing trade-offs. No decision exists in isolation. Increase support here, and something shifts there. Math makes these connections visible. It does not judge which trade-off is best. It clarifies what exists. The panic often demanded answers. Math offered clarity. These are not the same thing. Math is good at revealing that some goals conflict, that some desires cannot all be satisfied simultaneously. This is uncomfortable, but useful. Math is also good at protecting against narratives. When a story sounds too clean, math usually disagrees. Clean stories hide complexity. Math exposes it. This makes math unpopular in dramatic moments. It ruins neat conclusions, which is exactly why it is valuable. What math is actually good for is supporting long-term thinking. It accumulates. It remembers. It shows trajectories over decades, not headlines. This helps design systems that endure rather than react. Math is patient. It does not rush to judgment. It waits. What math is not good for is assigning meaning. It cannot tell you whether a society is thriving. It cannot measure fulfillment. It cannot decide what kind of future is desirable. These are human questions. Math provides constraints. Humans choose within them. Confusing these roles creates frustration. The panic expected math to justify values. It cannot. Math is also not good at persuasion. It does not inspire. It does not motivate. It explains. Explanation is quiet. In a loud world, explanation struggles. But without it, decisions drift. Math is good at grounding conversation. It anchors debate in something shared. Not because numbers are sacred, but because they are explicit. They can be questioned, revised, improved. This makes them safer than intuition, which feels confident but hides bias. Math is also good at reminding us what we do not know. Every projection comes with caveats, error bars, confidence intervals. These are not disclaimers. They are warnings. Warnings against certainty. The panic ignored these warnings. Math did not. What math is actually good for is making policy consequences visible, not intentions. Intentions are easy. Consequences are harder. Math traces implications. If this, then that. It does not say do this. It says this leads here. This distinction matters. Math is not a policy. It is a map. Maps do not tell you where to go. They show terrain. Ignoring the terrain does not make it flat. The panic often treated math as an enemy, as a bearer of bad news. This was unfair. Math did not create the news. It reported it, quietly, without agenda. The math behind population change was never alarmist. It was descriptive. The alarm came later, from interpretation. What math is actually good for is cooling overheated debates. When discussions spiral, math asks boring questions. How large is the effect? How confident are we? How sensitive is this result? These questions slow momentum, which is sometimes exactly what is needed. Math is also good at separating signal from noise. Short-term fluctuations feel dramatic. Math places them in context. It asks whether a change is meaningful or random. This prevents overreaction. When people listen, what math is not good for is certainty about complex human futures. It cannot replace judgment. It cannot replace ethics. It cannot replace empathy. When people ask math to do these things, they are disappointed and then angry. Math did not fail. It was misused. The most useful role math plays in demographic discussions is quiet. It keeps the conversation honest. It resists exaggeration. It insists on clarity. It does not panic. It does not soothe. It just sits there, showing relationships. Waiting, what the math is actually good for, is reminding us that trends are not commands. They are summaries. They describe where we have been, not where we must go. This reminder is subtle, but powerful. It preserves agency. It leaves room for choice. The panic tried to turn math into fate. Math refused. It continued being a tool, a limited one, a useful one, a boring one, which is exactly what makes it trustworthy. In the end, math does not decide futures. People do. Math helps them understand consequences. That is its role. Nothing more, nothing less. When allowed to stay in that role, math is calm, helpful, quiet, and deeply uninterested in panic. It does not demand action. It supports thinking, which is far less exciting and far more effective if we let it be, without asking it to shout, without forcing it to comfort, without pretending it knows what kind of world we want. Math does not want to lead. It wants to assist, and assistance, while rarely celebrated, is often what keeps systems from making irreversible mistakes. The math is not the message, it is the lens. What we see through it depends on how steady our hands are, and how willing we are to look slowly, without fear, without urgency, without asking it to be more than it is. A tool, waiting patiently, as it always has, for someone to use it with care. A very calm ending about very big numbers is not an ending at all. It is more like a settling. After all the graphs, the words, the fears, and the projections, the numbers are still here. Quiet, patient, unimpressed by how much attention they received. Big numbers have a strange effect on people. They make us feel small. They make us feel late. They make us feel like something important is slipping past us while we are distracted. Population numbers are especially good at this. They stretch across generations. They do not hurry. They do not explain themselves. They simply accumulate. And accumulation feels heavy. The calm ending begins with accepting that nothing dramatic needs to happen next. No final verdict. No sudden realization. Just continuation. The numbers will update next year. They always do. Some will go up. Some will go down. Most will move slightly. This slight movement is not failure. It is life happening at a pace that refuses to be rushed. Very big numbers are slow by nature. They are made of many small decisions, many quiet evenings, many ordinary lives. The panic tried to make these numbers loud, but loudness does not suit them. They are better suited to patience. The calm ending is also a reminder that humans have always lived inside trends they did not fully understand. They farmed before knowing yields. They traded before understanding markets. They formed families before anyone counted them. Life did not wait for clarity. It moved forward anyway. The numbers came later, as descriptions, not instructions. Very big numbers are summaries. They compress countless stories into something manageable, but compression loses texture. The calm ending invites texture back in. Behind every data point is a life that did not consult a graph. Someone decided something. For reasons that made sense at the time, the number recorded it. Nothing more, nothing less. The calm ending also means letting go of the idea that the future owes us familiarity. The future has never promised to look like the past. We just hoped it would. Population numbers reveal this gently. They show that change does not ask permission. It arrives, slowly, quietly, often unnoticed, until someone draws a line and points. The calm ending is accepting that pointing is not the same as understanding. Understanding takes time. Time is something demographics have plenty of. More than headlines. More than panic. Very big numbers stretch beyond our personal timelines. This can feel unsettling, but it can also be freeing. It reminds us that no single generation carries the entire future on its shoulders. The future is shared, distributed, passed along gradually. The calm ending is stepping back from urgency, not because nothing matters, but because urgency distorts scale. It makes slow change feel like emergency, and emergency thinking leads to rushed decisions. Rushed decisions are rarely kind. Big numbers reward kindness. They reward consistency. They reward patience. The calm ending is also an invitation to humility, to accept that we will not fully understand the long-term effects of today's choices, and that this has always been true. Every generation acts with incomplete information. Every generation worries. Every generation adapts. The numbers show this. If you look far enough back, you see survival, not perfection, not stability, just continuation. The calm ending does not deny challenges. Aging societies require care. Changing populations require adjustment. These are real, but they are not catastrophes. They are responsibilities. Responsibilities grow out of change, not panic. The calm ending is letting numbers be boring again, letting them return to their natural state. Tables, trends, reges, quiet signals. Not omens, not verdicts, not threats, just measurements. The calm ending is remembering that math does not care if we are afraid. It will keep counting. It will keep updating. It will keep offering information, whether we listen calmly or not. The numbers are indifferent. Our interpretations are not. The calm ending is choosing interpretation deliberately, choosing language that fits the data, not language that overwhelms it. Choosing metaphors that explain, not ones that terrify. The calm ending is recognizing that population change is not a story with a climax. It is a background process, like erosion or growth, always happening, rarely noticed, never stopping. Very big numbers do not rush. They accumulate quietly. The calm ending is realizing that nothing needs to be solved tonight. No immediate action is required to justify your existence. No demographic target demands personal sacrifice. The numbers describe, they do not demand. The calm ending is permission to rest, to let the future remain unfinished, to accept that uncertainty is not a flaw, it is a condition, one we have always lived with, even when we pretended otherwise. Very big numbers will continue their slow work. They will record births, ages, movements. They will reflect choices made for reasons no model could predict. They will surprise analysts. They always do. The calm ending is not about optimism or pessimism. It is about proportion, about matching emotion to scale. Big numbers require small reactions, careful ones, thoughtful ones, not panic. The calm ending is allowing the mind to slow down to match the pace of the data, which is very slow, almost soothing. The kind of pace that makes it easier to drift, to stop trying to control outcomes, to accept that the future is not something to defeat. It is something to inhabit, 1 year at a time. The calm ending is remembering that humanity has always lived inside uncertainty, and that this uncertainty did not prevent art, or love, or meaning, or continuation. The numbers did not erase any of that. They simply counted around it. Very big numbers can feel overwhelming, but they are made of very small moments. Moments like this one, quiet, undemanding, unremarkable. The calm ending is allowing that to be enough. To trust that slow systems respond slowly, that adaptation happens gradually, that no single chart contains destiny. The calm ending is letting the future breathe, and letting yourself do the same. The numbers will still be there tomorrow. They will still be big, still slow, still uninterested in panic, and that, in the end, is their greatest comfort. Because while everything else speeds up, the numbers remain patient, counting, waiting, unmoved, as they always have, and always will, until the next update. Which can wait. So can you.